Hey, welcome back, my friend. If you are new here, hello, I am so glad you found this little corner of the night. And if you have been here before, well, you already know how this works. You get comfortable, the world outside goes quiet, and together we slip into a story that has been waiting centuries to be told. Tonight we're going to go somewhere that most history books barely mention. Not a battlefield, not a king's throne room, not a war. Tonight we step through a very different kind of door. Imagine a little girl, maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. She has her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She laughs too loudly. She runs in the garden. She has probably never once thought about God for more than a few minutes at a time. And then, one morning, her father sits her down, tells her she's going somewhere special, a holy place, a safe place. She packs a small bundle. She hugs her mother, who is crying, though she tries to hide it. She walks through a gate, and the gate closes behind her. She will live behind that wall for the rest of her life. She did not choose this. She was 7 years old. Before we go deeper into this story, I want to take just a moment to ask you something small. If this kind of storytelling, slow, honest, and a little bit spine-tingling, is something that makes your evenings better, it would truly mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button right now and dropped a like on this video. You do not have to. But if you feel like this is your kind of place, that is the best way to tell me. And hey, I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from tonight? Your bed? Your couch? A late night snack in the kitchen? Drop it in the comments. I love hearing from you. Now dim the lights if you can. Let the world get a little softer around the edges, and let us go back, way, way back, the Middle Ages. Roughly the 5th century through the 15th century, roughly 1,000 years of European history that we tend to imagine as all swords and plague and dramatic beards. And yes, there was plenty of that. But tucked into the hills of France, the valleys of Germany, the English countryside, the plains of northern Italy, there were thousands of convents. Stone buildings surrounded by thick walls, gardens growing inside, bells ringing at hours most of us would rather be unconscious, and inside women. By the time England's King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s, there were roughly 150 nunneries scattered across the English landscape alone. Across all of Europe, the numbers were staggering. These were not small communities. These were not quiet little chapels with a handful of gentle ladies in white. These were powerful institutions, economic engines, centres of knowledge, places where women wielded a kind of influence that almost nowhere else would allow them. And also, let us be honest, sometimes prisons in everything but name. So here is the question that should keep you awake tonight more than any ghost story. Who were these women? Why did they go in, and did they actually want to be there? The answer, it turns out, is messy and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Let us start with the ones who truly wanted to be there. Because they existed, and their stories matter. In the early centuries of Christian monasticism, women were actually among the fiercest pioneers. Not followers, pioneers. As far back as the 3rd and 4th centuries, women like Syncletica of Alexandria and Sarah of the Desert had walked into the wilderness of Egypt and lived as hermits alone, praying fasting years before most male monasteries even existed. These were not timid women. These were women who looked at the world, the marriage markets, the endless pregnancies, the legal reality that they had almost no rights of their own, and made a radical choice. I want something different. I want to think. I want to serve something larger than a husband's household. I want to matter in a way this world does not allow. And for a particular kind of woman, intellectually hungry, spiritually alive, desperate for something beyond the kitchen and the cradle, the convent was not a cage. It was the only open door. Think about it this way. In medieval Europe, a woman had roughly speaking 2 paths. Marriage, or the convent. That is it. Those were the options. Not a career, not university, not the option to just live independently. An unmarried woman who was not connected to a religious institution was regarded with deep suspicion. She was a loose thread in the social fabric, a problem to be solved. The historian Joanne McNamara, professor at Hunter College in New York, put it plainly in her research: the religious life provided upper-class women with an alternative to marriage and a respected place in widowhood. For lower-class women, it offered dignified employment and charitable assistance. In other words, the convent was for many women genuinely the better deal. Now here is where things get complicated, because not every woman who entered those walls made that choice herself. Far from it. Medieval noble families had a problem, a practical, cold, financially devastating problem. Daughters. Do not get me wrong, they loved their daughters. Mostly. But daughters in medieval Europe came with a cost, a marriage dowry. To marry off a daughter into a family of equal or higher status, a father had to hand over an enormous sum. Land, silver, goods, sometimes entire estates. If you had one daughter, manageable, 2 daughters, stressful, 3 daughters, 4 daughters, 5 daughters. Suddenly you are staring at financial ruin. But here is the thing, the church offered an alternative. A convent dowry, sometimes called a spiritual dowry, was significantly cheaper than a marriage dowry. You could place your daughter in a respectable institution, preserve the family's social standing, protect the family wealth, and as a bonus earn yourself some guaranteed prayers for your immortal soul. From a purely mathematical standpoint, it made sense. So what did many families do? They looked at their 3 or 4 daughters, chose the one most likely to make a good marriage, beautiful, healthy, charming, got her a husband, and sent the others to the convent. By the 16th century, in cities like Florence and Venice, historians estimate that as many as half of all women from elite noble families were living behind convent walls. Half. Not because half of them had a burning spiritual calling, but because it was cheaper and tidier than finding them all husbands. A Venetian law from the period actually contained this haunting phrase. It lamented the fate of so many daughters of noble families, who were, and I am paraphrasing here because this deserves to land imprisoned in monasteries with just tears and complaints. Those are not the words of religious devotion. Those are the words of a society that knew exactly what it was doing and did it anyway. And who were these girls? Sometimes they were the daughters no one wanted to deal with. Too plain to attract a good husband. Too clever and loud and difficult in a world that wanted women quiet, disabled, illegitimate, simply inconvenient. There was a woman named Arcangela Tarabotti born in Venice in 1604. She was the oldest of 5 daughters. She was also disabled, and in the logic of her world, those 2 facts together sealed her fate. Her father placed her in a convent at age 11. She spent the rest of her life there, and she spent that life writing furiously, brilliantly, angrily about what it meant to be placed in a holy house, not because of God, but because of arithmetic. She called it monastic tyranny. She wrote books about it, and somehow, remarkably, those books survived, and we can read them today. Then there were the widows, women who had been married, whose husbands had died, and who found themselves suddenly alone in a world that had no particularly safe place for them. A convent offered stability, community, protection, a reason to get up in the morning. For these women the walls were not a trap, they were shelter. And then perhaps the most surprising category of all, there were the women who chose it not out of desperation, but out of genuine radical ambition. Because here is the secret that medieval Europe tried very hard to keep. The convent was the most intellectually free space available to women anywhere in the world. A woman inside those walls could study theology, a subject that no university would teach her. She could copy manuscripts. She could compose music. She could run an institution that employed hundreds of people. She could write letters to kings and emperors and have them taken seriously. The philosopher and scholar Erasmus, writing in 1523, actually told the story of a young woman who voluntarily entered a convent specifically for intellectual stimulation and independence. Not for God, for books and freedom. The historian Eileen Power, one of the great medieval scholars of the 20th century, described the convent as, and I love this phrase, a refuge of female intellectuals. A refuge. Not a prison. A refuge. For a particular kind of woman in a particular kind of world, that is exactly what it was. So we have 3 women standing at the convent gate. The first is dragged there at age 7 by a father who cannot afford her future. The second walks there at 40, a widow with nowhere else to go, grateful for the walls. The third arrives at 18 with fire in her eyes, a hunger for learning that no marriage could ever feed, ready to spend her life thinking and writing and praying on her own terms. 3 women, 1 gate, 3 completely different stories, and all of them true. Now here is something that surprises most people when they first learn about this period. The church itself, the institution that ran these convents, was not entirely blind to what was happening. As far back as the 12th century, a monk named Peter the Venerable, one of the most respected churchmen of his era, looked at a newly founded convent full of women placed there by their families, and called it plainly and without apology, a glorious prison. He knew, they all knew, and yet the system continued. Because it worked. It worked for families, it worked financially for the church, and in a twisted way it worked for a society that needed somewhere to put women who did not fit neatly into the only other box available. There is one more group I want to mention before we move on. Girls. Very young girls. Sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old. They were called oblates, a word from the Latin meaning offered up. A family would bring a young child to the convent sometimes because they were deeply devout and believed they were giving their daughter to God. Sometimes because there were too many mouths to feed, and the convent would educate her and keep her safe. These children grew up inside those walls. They learned to read and write in an age when most women could not. They learned music. They learned Latin. They knew no other home. And when they reached their mid-teens, they were given a choice: take your vows and stay or leave. Some left. Some stayed because they genuinely wanted to. And some stayed because the world outside had become so foreign and frightening to them that the only home they had ever known was the only place they could imagine being. 1,000 years of women, millions of individual stories, and almost every single one filtered through the same question. Did she choose this? The answer is never simple. It was never meant to be. Because the world these women lived in did not really offer the kind of choice we mean when we use that word. Not the way you or I think about choice. Sitting with a cup of coffee, scrolling through your options, weighing what makes you happy. Their choices were made inside walls, social walls, financial walls, legal walls that were already so narrow that sometimes a convent was simply the widest door in the room. And yet, some of them walked through it and found something remarkable on the other side. Something that would change the world in ways no one could have predicted from those stone courtyards and those early morning bells. But to understand what they found, we first need to understand what happened after the gate closed behind them. What was the ritual that transformed a girl into a bride of Christ? What did it feel like to stand in that chapel, dressed in bridal white, and prepare to marry someone you could not see? Because the ceremony of becoming a nun is one of the most haunting, beautiful, and deeply strange rituals in the entire history of the human relationship with the divine. And that is exactly where we're going next. So you are still with me. Good. Because what we're about to walk through together is one of the strangest, most beautiful and most quietly devastating ceremonies in the entire history of the Western world. And it happened in one form or another to millions of women, across 1,000 years, in stone chapels scattered from the cliffs of England to the sun-baked valleys of Sicily. We left off in part 1 with a gate closing, a girl on one side, her old life on the other. Now let's go inside and find out what happened next. There is a word I want you to hold on to for a moment. Oblate. From the Latin oblatus, which means quite simply offered up. When a medieval family placed a young child in a convent, sometimes as young as 5, sometimes 6 or 7 years old, that child was called an oblate, not a student, not a visitor, offered up. The language itself tells you everything you need to know about the power dynamics at work. The child had not offered herself, the family had offered her, to God, to the institution, to a life that had already been decided before the girl was old enough to have an opinion about it. And here is what I find both heartbreaking and quietly extraordinary about this. Most oblates, by the time they reached their mid-teens, had no meaningful memory of a life outside those walls. The convent was not a place they had been sent. It was simply home, the garden where they played, the bells that marked every hour of their days, the older nuns who had become in every practical sense family. When the time came for them to make a formal choice to take vows or to leave, many stayed not because they were forced to, but because everything they had ever loved was inside those walls. Is that freedom? Is that captivity? I genuinely do not know. And I think the honest answer is both at the same time. But let's talk about what happened to the girls who arrived older, teenagers, young women in their late teens or early 20s, women who had grown up in the outside world, who had worn silk and danced at festivals, and maybe thought about a particular young man from time to time. For these women, the path to becoming a nun was not immediate. It was a long, slow, carefully staged transformation. And it began with a period called the postulancy. The word comes from the Latin postulare, to ask, to request. In the postulancy, a young woman was essentially a candidate. She wore plain clothes rather than the full habit. She attended prayers, she worked alongside the nuns, she ate the same sparse meals. She was testing the life, and the community was testing her. This was not a formality. It was a genuine probation. Saint Benedict, the 6th century Italian abbot, whose rule became the foundation for almost all medieval monastic life, wrote explicitly about this. He said, and I am paraphrasing from his rule, "Do not grant newcomers to the monastic life an easy entrance. Test the spirits to see if they are from God." Even Benedict understood that not everyone who showed up at the gate genuinely belonged there. After the postulancy, which could last anywhere from several months to a full year, came the novitiate. And this is where things begin to get deeply interesting. The novice was no longer just a candidate. She was now in formal training. She studied the rule of Benedict. She learned the cycle of liturgical prayer, the divine office, the 8 canonical hours that would structure every single day of her life from that point forward. She learned Latin because the entire liturgy was conducted in Latin. She learned to chant, to copy manuscripts, to understand the theology that underpinned everything she was doing. I want you to pause on that for a second. In a world where the vast majority of women, even wealthy women, received no formal education whatsoever, the novitiate of a medieval convent was by any honest measure one of the most rigorous educational programs available to a woman in Europe. Theology, Latin, music theory, manuscript writing, medicine, administration. Hildegard of Bingen, who we will talk about much more deeply in a later part of this story, entered a Benedictine community at age 8, as an oblate was educated entirely within its walls, and by the time she was in her late 30s had become one of the most learned people on the continent, not in spite of the convent, because of it. But let us get back to the novice. Because after 1 to 2 years of the novitiate, something remarkable happened. The day of the first profession, and if you think the ceremony that followed was just a quiet little ritual in a side chapel, I want you to think again. The ceremony of becoming a nun, the taking of the veil, the solemn vows, the final investiture was in every meaningful symbolic sense a wedding. Not a metaphor of a wedding, an actual wedding. In some medieval orders, the novice arrived at the chapel dressed in white just as a bride would be. Her family might be present. Candles were lit. Music was sung. In certain ceremonies documented from the early modern period ceremonies that had their roots deep in medieval practice, the novice processed into the church accompanied by violins, escorted by relatives dressed in the full bridal regalia of her social class. She was marrying someone, and that someone, according to the theology of the moment, was Jesus Christ. Can I ask you something? And I mean this genuinely, not rhetorically. Does that strike you as beautiful, or does it strike you as strange? Because when I first really sat with the image of a young woman, maybe 17 years old, walking down the aisle of a stone chapel in the middle of the French countryside, or the English countryside, or the German Rhineland dressed in white, preparing to pledge her entire life to a divine presence she could not see or touch, I felt both things simultaneously. A profound, aching beauty, and a chill. The ceremony itself moved in stages that mirrored almost precisely the stages of a secular wedding. First, the final renunciation of the world. The novice would be asked formally out loud before the assembled community whether she came freely, whether she was ready to leave the world behind. In some orders, this question was asked 3 times. 3 times she had to answer yes. Then came the hair. This is the part that stays with me. In medieval and early modern convents, a woman's hair was understood theologically, symbolically as her crowning beauty. The Church Fathers wrote about this explicitly. A woman's hair was her glory. It belonged, theologically speaking, first to God and then to her husband. When a nun took her vows, her hair was cut. Sometimes a single symbolic lock, sometimes nearly all of it. The abbess or the mistress of novices would take a pair of scissors, large, often silver, often ceremonial, and cut the hair close to the scalp. The cut hair was placed on a silver tray and carried away. Think about what that meant for a young woman who had grown up with her hair as part of her identity, who had perhaps spent years having it braided or dressed by her mother or her sisters, who associated it the way most women do with who she was, and now it fell lock by lock into a silver dish, offered up. In some orders the hair was burned afterward as a kind of ritual purification. In others it was kept, sometimes placed with a crucifix, sometimes simply stored. There are documented cases of families requesting their daughters' cut hair as a keepsake, as if receiving a piece of someone they were losing to a world they could not follow her into. After the hair, the white bridal garments were removed, and in their place came the habit. Now the habit was not uniform across all orders. The Benedictines wore black. The Cistercians, who were a stricter reform of the Benedictine tradition, wore white habits and black veils that earned them the name the White Ladies in parts of England. The Franciscan Poor Clares wore rough grey wool. The Dominicans wore black and white. Each habit was its own theology and fabric. The colour, the cut, the specific arrangement of the veil, every detail communicated which order you belonged to, what vows you had taken, and what your standing within the community was. A novice received a white veil, the colour of beginnings of not yet finished formation. A fully professed nun, having made her solemn vows, received the black veil, which in the symbolic language of the ceremony represented her death to the world. She was not metaphorically dying to her old life. In the eyes of the Church, she was literally dying. The woman who had existed before the daughter, the young woman with silk dresses and opinions about music, and perhaps strong feelings about that young man from the village. That woman was officially gone. A new person had been created, with a new name. The new name. Most orders required the novice to take a new name upon her profession. Sometimes the name was chosen for her by the abbess. Sometimes she was given a choice from a list of saints. Sometimes in later periods she might choose herself. But the implication was always the same. The name you were born with belonged to your family, your blood, your history. The name you received in the chapel belonged to God. Imagine being 19 years old and being told the person you have been for 19 years no longer exists. Here is who you are now. Some women found this liberating beyond description, some found it unbearable, and some, if the later testimony of nuns who left convents is any indication, spent decades quietly grieving the person they used to be, even while genuinely believing in the vows they had taken. And then came the moment that sealed everything, the solemn vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. 3 words, 3 promises, each one of them the surrender of something the rest of the world considered fundamental. Poverty, no personal possessions, nothing is yours. The clothes on your body belong to the community. The book you read belongs to the community. The ring on your finger, yes, some orders gave nuns a ring just as a bride receives a ring, even that belongs to the community. Chastity, the surrender of any possibility of physical intimacy of motherhood, of the particular kind of love that passes between 2 people who have chosen each other. And obedience, perhaps the hardest of all, to truly understand from the outside. Obedience meant that your own judgment, your personal preferences, your desires, your opinions about how things should be done, were subordinated permanently and without reservation to the will of your abbess, your rule, and your God. You did not get to decide when to sleep or wake. You did not get to decide what to eat or when. You did not get to decide whether to speak or be silent. Every aspect of daily existence was already decided for you. And here is the strange counterintuitive truth that some of the women who genuinely embraced this life tried to articulate in their writings. For certain people who were already exhausted by the relentless noise of choice, of social performance, of trying to figure out who they were supposed to be in a world that kept changing its expectations, the complete surrender of personal decision was not a loss. It was a rest. The 12th century mystic and abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote letters describing her convent as a place where the soul could finally stop fighting itself, where the constant negotiation of identity, who are you, what do you want, who do you belong to, simply ceased. You belong to God. That was the whole answer, and for some people apparently that was enough, more than enough. Of course for others, particularly for those who'd been placed there by their families without a genuine calling, the same surrender felt exactly like what it looked like from the outside, a cage. The historian Eileen Power, who spent decades studying medieval nunneries in England and France, found documented cases of novices weeping during their profession ceremonies, not from emotion or spiritual overwhelm, from grief and resistance. There are records from convents in 14th century England of women who, even after taking their vows, continued to wear secular jewellery under their habits, who kept small personal objects hidden in their cells, a lock of hair, a ring, a scrap of silk from a dress they had worn at a dance years before, small quiet rebellions against the erasure of who they had been. And you know what, I find those hidden objects more moving than almost anything else in this story, because they remind us that behind every veil was a person, a specific individual, irreducibly human person with a history and a self, and a set of feelings that no ceremony, however powerful, could fully erase. Now I want to end this part of our journey tonight with something that I think changes how you see everything we have talked about so far. The ceremony we have walked through, the hair, the habit, the new name, the vows, was experienced in the medieval period as something genuinely sacred, not as a legal transaction, not as a social convenience, as a moment in which the divine and the human met. The most senior women in the community, the abbess, the older professed nuns, believed with everything they had that in the moment a young woman made her vows, something real happened. Not symbolic, real. A soul was consecrated, a life was set apart. And the woman kneeling at the altar, whatever her reasons for being there, whatever complicated story had brought her to that chapel on that particular morning, became in the eyes of everyone present someone extraordinary, not less than a woman, something more, a bride of Christ, set apart from the ordinary world, given access to a form of spiritual authority that almost no other woman in medieval Europe was permitted to hold. And what exactly that authority looked like, what these women actually did with it, once the ceremony was over and the veil was on, and the day began, that is where we are heading next. Because the daily life inside those walls was nothing like what most people imagine. The bell started ringing at 2 a.m, and what happened in those hours, day after day, year after year, inside those stone courtyards and cold chapels, was in its own way one of the most radical experiments in human organisation that the medieval world ever attempted. 2 o'clock in the morning. Picture that for a moment. Not 2 in the afternoon, not 2 after a late night out, 2 in the morning, in the absolute black of a medieval winter, when the world outside the convent walls is silent and frozen, and every single human being with any reasonable judgment is deeply blissfully asleep. A bell rings, not a soft chime, not a gentle nudge, a bell, loud, insistent, unapologetic, and every nun in that dormitory, whether she's 20 years old or 60, whether she went to bed exhausted from a day of physical labour or simply from the bone-deep cold, has to get up, right now, not in a few minutes, not after she finds her shoes, right now. This was Matins, the first canonical hour of the day, and it was the heartbeat around which every single day of a medieval nun's life was organised. Let me walk you through a full day inside those walls, not the idealised version, not the version that sounds like a peaceful retreat. The real version with cold floors and empty stomachs, and the particular kind of fatigue that comes from having your sleep interrupted by a bell at 2 a.m. every single night of your life. Because I think that is the only honest way to understand what these women actually lived through. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the early 6th century by a man who clearly did not place excessive value on a good night's sleep, divided every day into 8 canonical hours, 8 fixed times of communal prayer. 8 times a day, every day, without exception, the bell rang and the nuns stopped whatever they were doing and went to chapel. 8 times. Now I want you to think about that in your own life. What if 8 times every single day, regardless of what you were in the middle of, a bell rang and you had to stop and go do something else? You are in the middle of cooking. Bell rings. You're in the middle of reading something fascinating. Bell rings. You're finally getting to a comfortable temperature under your one woolen blanket. Bell rings. That is the rhythm of a medieval convent, and it never stopped. Not on Sundays, not on feast days, not in winter, not in summer. For 50 years, if you lived that long, the bell rang and you went. So here is how the day actually unfolded. 2 a.m. matins. The nuns rose, filed into the chapel in the dark and chanted psalms. The entire Psalter, all 150 psalms, was worked through every single week. 150 psalms distributed across 8 daily services across 7 days. The mathematics alone are quietly staggering. After matins, the nuns did not simply go back to bed and sleep until morning like sensible people. They returned to the dormitory for a few hours of rest. And here I use the word rest generously, because the dormitory in a medieval convent was not a warm and cosy place. It was a large communal room, long rows of wooden bed frames lined with straw mattresses, no curtains, no privacy. A nun slept fully clothed habit on hood, up so that she could be out of bed and moving the moment that bell rang again without having to fumble in the dark for her clothes. The bed she slept in was covered by 1 or 2 woolen blankets. In a northern European winter in England, in Germany and northern France, that meant she was cold. Not uncomfortable cold, actually genuinely cold. And she got up again at dawn around 5 in the morning for Lauds. Now here is something that surprised me when I first really dug into this. The sleep deprivation was not an accident, it was the point. St. Benedict wrote explicitly in his rule that the monastic schedule was designed to make the mind and the will submissive to God. Submissive. The word is right there. When you are perpetually a little tired, when you have never once in your entire adult life woken up feeling truly rested, the edges of your personal self begin to blur. Your preferences matter less. Your small resistances dissolve. Your capacity to maintain the private inner world of ambition and self-interest that most of us carry around with us every day, that capacity gets worn smooth, the way a stone gets worn smooth by moving water. And what fills that space, according to Benedict, God? Whether you find that beautiful or unsettling probably depends on who you are. Personally, I find it both. After Lauds at dawn, the nuns washed cold water always and ate a very small breakfast. Bread, beer. Let me pause on the beer for a second, because I know that probably stopped at least a few of you. Yes, beer for breakfast in a convent. This was not unusual or scandalous. This was practical. In medieval Europe, the water supply was frequently contaminated. Rivers and wells carried things that would make you violently ill or worse. Beer, because it was brewed with heat, was significantly safer to drink than most water, so everyone drank it. Men, women, children, nuns. It was weak compared to modern beer, lower in alcohol content, more like a thick grain drink than what we would recognise today. But still, beer for breakfast. I have to admit that when I first read this, my initial thought was honestly, that does not sound terrible. After the modest breakfast came prime at 6 in the morning. And then, and this is where the day becomes something genuinely interesting, the chapter. Every morning after prime, the entire community gathered in a room called the chapter house. A section of the Rule of Benedict was read aloud, literally a chapter of the text, which is why the meeting was called a chapter. Then came something that I think is one of the most remarkable practices in medieval institutional history. Each nun was invited or required, depending on the convent, to confess her faults publicly. Not her spiritual sins, her practical faults from the previous day. She arrived late to a service. She spoke when she should have been silent. She failed to complete her work. She was impatient with a sister. Public. Out loud. In front of everyone. And then the assembled community, together with the abbess, would decide the appropriate correction. Now imagine doing that every single morning. Imagine standing up in a room full of the people you live and work and pray with every single day of your life and saying out loud, "Here is where I fell short yesterday." I think most of us, if we are being honest, would find that either deeply clarifying or utterly unbearable, and probably both at different moments. After the chapter tierce, the third canonical hour at 9 in the morning, and then the work began. Because here is something that the romanticised image of medieval convent life tends to overlook. These women worked hard, physically, practically without complaint, or at least without permitted complaint. The rule of St. Benedict operated on a principle you have probably heard condensed into the Latin phrase, ora et labora, pray and work. The idea was that both prayer and labour were sacred acts, that you could serve God just as genuinely with your hands in the earth of the kitchen garden as you could with your voice in the chapel. So after tierce the nuns dispersed to their assigned work. And the work varied enormously depending on the convent, the season, and the individual's role. Some worked in the kitchen, grinding grain, baking bread, preparing the enormous quantities of soup and stew that fed the community. Some worked in the garden, planting, tending, harvesting the vegetables that formed the backbone of the convent diet. Turnips, parsnips, leeks, onions, legumes, herbs for medicine as well as cooking. Some worked in the scriptorium, the writing room, copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, creating the books that were the single most valuable objects in the medieval world. Some worked in the infirmary, caring for the sick nuns and the community members who came to the convent for medical help. Some worked in the schoolroom, teaching the young girls who had been entrusted to the convent's care. And some in the more aristocratic convents, particularly in England and France and Italy, worked at embroidery so exquisite that it was commissioned by kings and displayed in cathedral treasuries. English medieval embroidery known as Opus Anglicanum, which simply means English work, was famous across the continent. Popes owned it, emperors displayed it, and in significant part it was made by the hands of nuns working in cold rooms by whatever natural light reached them through high stone windows. At midday came Sext the sixth canonical hour, followed by the main meal of the day. And this is where we arrive at one of the strangest, most quietly haunting daily rituals of medieval convent life. The meal was eaten in silence, complete silence. No conversation, no laughter, no comment on the food. The nuns sat at long tables arranged along the walls of the refectory and they ate, and the only sound aside from the scraping of wooden bowls and the soft movements of the servers was one voice. One nun standing at a raised pulpit built into the wall of the refectory reading aloud. Not chatting, reading. Scripture, usually the Psalms, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, or the lives of the saints, or the rule of Benedict itself read through repeatedly across the year. Imagine eating every meal of your life, every lunch, every dinner for decades with one voice reading scripture to you and complete silence around you. No small talk, no gossip, no discussion about whether the pottage needed more salt. You wanted to ask your neighbour to pass the bread, you used sign language. Medieval monastic communities actually developed elaborate systems of hand signals specifically for use in the refectory and other silent spaces, specific gestures for bread, for fish, for water, for salt, documented in manuscripts that survive to this day. There is something I find both deeply funny and quietly beautiful about that. A community of women who had vowed to serve God in silence, sitting together, eating vegetable soup, passing salt, with a specific hand gesture, while someone read the Book of Psalms from a stone pulpit. It is so far from anything we would recognize as normal, and yet apparently you can get used to anything. The main meal itself followed the rules guidelines fairly closely, at least in theory. 2 cooked dishes usually, bread always, vegetables, legumes, fish on Fridays and during the long fasting seasons of Advent and Lent. Meat from 4-footed animals, what the rule called quadrupeds, was forbidden except for the sick. Now in practice, the gap between the rule's ideals and the actual food on the table widened considerably over the centuries. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the richer convents, the Benedictine abbeys with substantial land and patronage, had found very creative ways to interpret "the flesh of quadrupeds is forbidden." They built a separate room adjacent to the refectory called the misericord, from the Latin for mercy, where because it was technically a different room, and not the refectory, the rule technically did not apply, and in the misericord the nuns who needed it, which mysteriously seemed to include a large number of healthy nuns, ate meat. By 1336, Pope Benedict XII had to formally intervene and set clearer rules about when meat could and could not be eaten. He permitted it on 4 days outside of fasting periods, and the records of some convents from the following period show the consumption of beef mutton, veal, swan, goose, and something described with evident enthusiasm as suckling pig, in a convent. Rule of poverty and simplicity. Sure, pass the suckling pig. After the main meal, a short period of rest, the only rest that was formally scheduled into the day besides sleep. Then, none at 3 in the afternoon. More work. Vespers at 6, evening prayer, the most beautiful of the canonical hours in terms of the liturgical music composed for it. A light supper eaten in the same silence as dinner, and then compline at 9 in the evening, the final prayer of the day, after which speaking was forbidden entirely until the following morning. The great silence. From compline to the end of the next morning's chapter. Hours of formal, rule-enforced quiet. And then back to the dormitory. Back to the wooden frame and the straw mattress and the woolen blanket. Back to the cold, and the wait for the bell at 2 in the morning, which would come again without fail as it had come the night before and the night before that and every night for the entirety of a medieval nun's life. Now I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. When you lay all of this out, the interrupted sleep, the cold, the enforced silence, the rigid schedule, the total subordination of personal preference to communal rule, it is very easy to read it as a kind of organised misery. And for some women inside those walls it absolutely was. But here is what I keep coming back to, and what I think the historians who have studied this most deeply keep coming back to as well. For a significant number of these women, perhaps more than we might expect, this life was not misery, it was order, in a world that offered women almost no agency, no consistency, no safety from the arbitrary decisions of fathers and husbands and wars and plagues. The convent offered something genuinely rare, a day that would be the same tomorrow as it was today, a community that would not abandon you, a rhythm so deeply embedded that it became over years something like the rhythm of your own heartbeat. You knew exactly what you were doing at every moment. You knew exactly what was expected of you. You knew within the narrow but real bounds of your role that your life had meaning. That for many women in medieval Europe was not a small thing. That was the most important thing. But what I have not yet told you is what happened around the edges of that rigid schedule. In the hours between services, in the scriptorium, in the garden, in the spaces where women who had been told to be silent found quiet ways to speak anyway. Because the convent was not just a schedule, it was also an economy, a political structure, a centre of intellectual and artistic life more vibrant than almost anywhere else available to women in the medieval world. And the resources that flowed through those walls, the land, the labour, the knowledge, the money were controlled, managed and fiercely defended by women who turned out to be extraordinarily good at it. How good? Good enough to make kings uncomfortable. Good enough that some abbesses held more practical power than the bishops who were theoretically their superiors. Good enough that the history of medieval Europe cannot honestly be told without acknowledging what happened inside those walls. That is exactly where we're going next. Right. Let us talk about power. Real power. Not the soft spiritual kind that gets romanticized in old paintings. Not the gentle influence of a holy woman kneeling in prayer, but hard practical political economic power, the kind that controls land and labour and law, the kind that makes kings write letters and bishops sweat. Because here is something that the standard history textbooks rarely make room for. Some of the most powerful institutional leaders in medieval Europe were women, and they ran their kingdoms from behind convent walls. Start with this number and let it sit with you for a moment. By the time Henry VIII dissolved the English monasteries in the 1530s and 40s, monastic institutions, male and female combined, owned more than 1/4 of all cultivated land in England. 1/4 of an entire country. When Henry wanted to pay for his wars and replenish a treasury exhausted by his extraordinary personal spending habits, he did not raise taxes and hope for the best. He dissolved the monasteries and seized their assets, and the figure his chief minister Thomas Cromwell calculated in his Great Property Survey, the Valor Ecclesiasticus, was staggering. The Crown profited by roughly £1.5 million from the dissolution alone. In the 16th century, that is not a spiritual legacy, that is a property empire, and a meaningful portion of it was controlled, managed, and defended by women. Now, to understand how that happened, you have to understand what an abbess actually was. Not the gentle, vaguely saintly figure you might picture floating through a cloister in white. An abbess was in every functional sense a feudal lord. She held seigneurial authority, direct governing power over the lands attached to her convent. That meant she collected rents from the peasants who farmed those lands. She held courts. She administered justice. She imposed taxes. In some cases, she was responsible for providing soldiers in times of war, yes, soldiers drawn from the military obligations of the estates she controlled. She appointed local parish priests to the churches on her lands. She negotiated with bishops. She corresponded with popes. She managed relationships with the noble families whose daughters were in her care and whose donations kept her institution solvent. In some of the most powerful abbeys, the abbess's authority was described as comparable to that of a bishop. Not metaphorically comparable, functionally comparable. The abbess of Las Huelgas in Spain, one of the great Cistercian convents, had the authority to appoint priests, call synods, and issue decrees across her jurisdiction. Think about that. A woman in the 13th century calling a synod, deciding ecclesiastical policy, in a world where women were not permitted to preach, not permitted to take priestly orders, not permitted to have any formal voice in church governance. And yet there she was in her stone abbey with her crozier, the staff that symbolized abbatial power, the same staff a bishop carried making decisions that affected thousands of people. Let me tell you about one woman who, in my view, is one of the most quietly remarkable figures in the entire history of medieval England. Her name was Hilda, and if you've heard of Whitby, the dramatic cliff-top ruins on the Yorkshire coast that still stand today, the ones that supposedly inspired Bram Stoker when he was writing Dracula, then you have heard of the place she built. Hilda was born in 614 into the Northumbrian royal family. She did not become a nun until she was 33 years old, which in 7th century terms was not young. She had spent her entire adult life at court embedded in the political world of Anglo-Saxon England. And when she did take vows, she did not retreat from that world. She brought it inside with her. In 657, King Oswiu of Northumbria gave her 1,200 acres of land on the Yorkshire cliffs and charged her with founding a double monastery, a community of both monks and nuns at a place then called Streoneshalch. We know it today as Whitby. Hilda ran that institution for the rest of her life. She built a library. She established a theological school. She produced 5 future bishops from among the people she educated, 5 bishops from one abbey, and she did it so thoroughly that the Venerable Bede, writing in the early 8th century, described Whitby as, and I am borrowing his phrase here, a blaze of light that filled all of Britain with its splendour, from one woman on a cliff-top in Yorkshire. But the moment that crystallises Hilda's power more than anything else came in 664. King Oswiu, who was incidentally her cousin, needed to resolve a problem that was threatening to fracture the English Church. Celtic Christians and Roman Christians celebrated Easter on different dates. They practiced different styles of monastic tonsure, the ritual shaving of monks' heads. The king himself followed Celtic practice, while his queen Eanfeld followed Roman practice. And this had reached the point of genuine domestic and political absurdity. Some years the king was feasting for Easter, while the queen was still fasting for Lent, at the same table. The king called a synod, a formal council of all the leading churchmen and churchwomen of the Isles to settle the question once and for all. And where did he hold it at Hilda's monastery? The Synod of Whitby, 664, which determined the future direction of Christianity in England. One of the most consequential religious gatherings in British history was held inside a convent, hosted by its abbess, who had her own strong opinions about the outcome favoured the Celtic position, and yet with a quality I find genuinely admirable, accepted the synod's decision for Roman practice and changed her institution accordingly. Hilda did not win the argument, but she hosted the debate that changed the country, and then she made peace with the result. There is a kind of greatness in that, I think, that gets lost when we only look for power in the form of conquest and throne-sitting. Now Hilda is one of the most famous examples, but she was not an anomaly. She was part of a broader pattern of female institutional leadership that ran from the 7th century well into the late medieval period. Consider Fontevraud Abbey in the Loire Valley of France. Founded in 1101 by a charismatic wandering preacher named Robert of Arbrissel, Fontevraud was designed from the very beginning as a double community of men and women, where all authority over monks and nuns alike rested with the abbess. The monks were explicitly placed in service to the women. That is not my interpretation. That is what the founding statutes say. Fontevraud became over the following centuries the burial place of English royalty, specifically the early Plantagenets. Henry II is buried there. Eleanor of Aquitaine is buried there. Richard I, the Lionheart, is buried there. They chose to be buried in a convent, under the spiritual authority of an abbess, and by 1450 the Abbey of Fontevraud administered 78 dependent priories and more than 100 separate properties stretching from Picardy in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, one of the largest monastic estates in Europe, governed by a woman. Now I want to be honest about something, because I think intellectual honesty is more interesting than mythology. These women were powerful, yes. But the source of that power had complicated roots. In most cases, the great abbesses came from great families, noble families, royal families, families that had donated the land on which the convent was built, that continued to send their daughters, that provided the financial patronage that kept the institution solvent. An abbess was often chosen not purely on spiritual merit, though that mattered, but also on the basis of her family connections and social standing. Between 1189 and 1273 at the Abbey of Notre Dame of Soissons in France, 3 consecutive abbesses came from the same noble family, the House of Cherisy. Other powerful families cycled in and out of the abbess's chair, like a seat on a board of directors. The Bourbon family eventually made Fontevraud essentially their personal monastic headquarters, sending their daughters to be educated there, and then dispatching them as abbesses to other important meaning-wealthy French monasteries. At any given moment, multiple members of the House of Bourbon were simultaneously running religious institutions across France. So yes, these were women exercising real power, and that power was also inseparable from the class system that produced them, which raises a question I find genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. How much of this female authority was the Church respecting women, and how much was the Church respecting wealthy noble families who happened to be represented in the convent by women? I do not have a clean answer to that. The historical record does not give one. Both things were true simultaneously in the messy way that real history tends to work. What the record does show clearly and consistently is this. The abbesses who ran these institutions long-term were not figureheads. They were operators. They managed complex estates with multiple income streams, rents, donations, tithes, fees for prayers, fees for burials, revenue from markets and fairs held on their lands. They hired and supervised staff, stewards, bailiffs, farm managers, servants. They maintained relationships with their local bishops, with the papal curia in Rome, with the royal court. They negotiated, they litigated, they lobbied. The Historian from Ruling Women, a scholarly project examining medieval female authority, notes explicitly that the long-term economic success of a monastery depended above all on the managerial skills, policies and foresight of the abbesses who led it. Not their holiness, their management skills. And when those skills were present, when an abbess was sharp and strategic and willing to fight for her institution, the convent she led flourished in ways that outlasted dynasties. When those skills were absent, or when the institution fell into debt and mismanagement, the convents contracted, lost land, lost influence, and sometimes fell into a slow decline that made them vulnerable to the kind of episcopal intervention that male authorities were always watching for an opportunity to make. This is actually one of the most important structural tensions in all of medieval convent history, and one that is rarely talked about in the popular accounts, the relationship between abbesses and bishops. In theory, a bishop was the abbess's superior. He had canonical authority over the religious institutions in his diocese. He could send commissioners to inspect the convent, interview nuns, report on standards of observance. He could in principle intervene. In practice, it was far more complicated. The most powerful abbesses, those with royal patronage, substantial land holdings, and direct connections to Rome, operated largely outside the local bishop's control. Their institutions reported directly to the Pope, bypassing the episcopal hierarchy entirely. This was called being exempt from episcopal jurisdiction, and it was one of the most valuable privileges a medieval convent could hold. Hilda's biographer notes explicitly that abbesses of her type managed their own realms, normally ruled by the Pope, bypassing the local bishop. Think about what that means practically. The bishop a man wanted to send investigators to your convent. Sorry, papal exemption. You do not answer to him. You answer directly to Rome. That is not the position of a subordinate. That is the position of someone who has successfully structured their institution to report to the highest possible authority and made sure nobody in the middle could interfere. These women were not passively holy. They were strategically brilliant. And then, of course, the world changed, because it always does. Starting in the 13th century, a series of decrees began to quietly but systematically reduce the autonomy that powerful abbesses had spent centuries building. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued a decree called Periculoso. The title translates with wonderful bluntness as dangerous, which required that all women in religious life be enclosed behind walls permanently. No leaving the convent, no travelling, no direct engagement with the outside world. The justification was, of course, moral purity. Women needed to be protected from the world's temptations, or perhaps, and this is the reading that historians increasingly find more convincing, the world needed to be protected from women who are becoming inconveniently powerful. By the 1400s, the great abbesses who had counselled kings and hosted synods were increasingly managed, restricted, and replaced by male administrators. The land remained, the institutions remained, but the female authority that had once run them so brilliantly was being quietly dismantled piece by piece, decree by decree, century by century. And yet even inside that shrinking space, something extraordinary continued to grow. Because while the political and economic power of abbesses was being curtailed, from outside inside those walls in the scriptoriums and the gardens and the candlelit cells of medieval convents, women were doing something that nobody could take from them with a papal decree. They were writing, they were composing music, they were producing art and knowledge and ideas that would survive long after every abbess's political authority had been stripped away. And no figure in that story is more astonishing, more genuinely jaw-droppingly astonishing, then the woman who composed her own secret language corresponded with emperors, wrote medicine books, and described visions so vivid that they are still being analysed by scholars and scientists today. We've been circling her name for a while now. She can wait no longer. There are people who change their time, and then there are people who seem inexplicably to belong to no time at all, who reach so far beyond the world they were born into, that even 9 centuries later we are still trying to fully understand what they did. Hildegard of Bingen is one of those people, and the story of what she accomplished inside a stone convent in the 12th century, as a woman who had no formal right to a public voice, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of human thought. I am going to take my time with this one, because she deserves it. Let us start at the very beginning. The year is 1098. The place is a small village called Bermersheim in the Rhine Valley of what is now Western Germany. A noble family has just had their 10th child, a girl, and in the logic of the medieval world we have been talking about throughout this series, the 10th child of a wealthy family was often given to the church as a kind of tithe, a spiritual offering. 1/10 of one's wealth given to God. In this case, the offering was a sickly, strange little girl who was already seeing things that nobody else could see. Hildegard later wrote that she had her first vision at age 3 years old. She described colours and lights and shapes that filled her visual field not in dreams but in full waking consciousness. Not darkness accompanied by voices, light. Overwhelming, flooding, inexplicable light. She hid these experiences for most of her childhood, telling only her teacher, a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, who led the small convent attached to the monastery at Disibodenberg, where Hildegard had been placed at age 8. She hid them because she did not fully understand them, and also perhaps because she understood something else clearly, that a little girl claiming divine visions was a dangerous thing to be in a world that might decide those visions came from the wrong direction entirely. She hid them until she was 42 years old. And then, according to her own account, something happened that she could no longer contain. In 1140, a burning light descended from the sky and entered her heart and her mind. She described it as filling her entirely, not extinguishing her, not overwhelming her, but illuminating everything she had already known, the way you might illuminate a room that was always furnished but never lit. She described this light with a phrase that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. She called it the flaming light, and she experienced it not in a dream, not in a trance, but in full waking consciousness as naturally as she experienced the world around her. And a voice told her, "Write down what you see and hear." She was terrified. She argued with the voice. She made herself ill from the resistance, and then she obeyed. What followed over the next decade was a book called Scivias. The title is a contraction of the Latin phrase Scito vias Domini, know the ways of the Lord. 26 visions, described in meticulous detail, theology, cosmology, the structure of the universe described in the shape of an egg, the nature of the soul, the relationship between humanity and God, the meaning of creation, the mechanics of redemption. It took her 10 years to complete, and when a portion of it was read at the Council of Trier in 1147 and presented to Pope Eugene III, he gave it his formal papal approval, a woman's theological writing, approved by a pope in the 12th century. I want you to hold that for a moment because it is genuinely one of the most remarkable facts in medieval church history. The church that did not allow women to preach, that did not allow women to be ordained, that routinely dismissed women's theological opinions as spiritually unreliable, read Hildegard's visions and said, "This is genuine. Continue." How? Because Hildegard framed everything, every vision, every theological claim, every opinion as the direct word of God spoken through her. She did not write as Hildegard the abbess expressing her views. She wrote as a feather, she said, carried on the breath of God. The living light was speaking. She was merely the instrument. It was, if you will forgive me for saying this, extraordinary clever. Not cynically clever, genuinely clever. Because by making herself the vessel rather than the author, she created a theological framework in which her words could not be dismissed on the basis of her sex. God does not have a sex, and if God was speaking well, you cannot tell God to be quiet. But here is what I find even more remarkable than the theological strategy. It is what she actually said. Because Hildegard was not simply repeating orthodox doctrine in a pretty new packaging. She was thinking, really genuinely independently thinking in ways that pushed against the boundaries of what was acceptable and sometimes pushed right through them. She wrote about the concept she called viriditas greenness, the living force that flows through all of creation, the vitality of the natural world as an expression of the divine. In Hildegard's theology, nature was not a fallen realm to be distrusted. Nature was the evidence of God. The grass and the flowers and the trees were not obstacles to holiness. They were the ongoing proof of it. From a 12th century Benedictine nun, whose church generally regarded the physical world with considerable suspicion. And then there were her medical writings, between 1151 and 1158, while simultaneously running a new convent managing an institutional move that had taken enormous political effort to achieve and corresponding with roughly half of the powerful people in Europe. Hildegard wrote 2 books on medicine and natural science. The first Physica was an encyclopedic survey of the medicinal properties of more than 200 plants, plus sections on minerals, animals, fish, birds, and reptiles. It documented the uses of herbs for everything from digestive ailments to wounds to eye problems. And it contains, this is a wonderful historical footnote, what appears to be one of the first recorded mentions of using hops in beer as a preservative. The woman who helped invent the modern beer recipe was a medieval nun. You're welcome for that information. The second book, Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures, went further. Much further. It was not a herbal handbook. It was a medical theory. A complete philosophy of the human body and its relationship to the cosmos. Hildegard described the 4 humours, yes, that was standard medieval medicine, but she gave them her own framework, her own logic, her own hierarchy. She discussed the relationship between the body's internal balance and the phases of the moon. She described diagnostic techniques, how to read a patient's blood, pulse, urine and stool. She gave specific instructions on bloodletting, not vaguely but precisely, including how much blood to take, described with characteristically medieval measurement, the amount that a thirsty person can swallow in one gulp. I find that image both very practical and somehow deeply human. But none of this is what makes Causae et Curae genuinely revolutionary. What makes it revolutionary is that Hildegard wrote explicitly in her own Latin about female sexuality, female pleasure, and women's physiology in the 12th century, in a medical text written by a celibate nun. She wrote about menstrual health with sympathy rather than theological condemnation. She described female physiology in terms that treated women as full human beings rather than as defective versions of men, explicitly rejecting the Aristotelian tradition that classified women as anatomically inferior. And she discussed human sexuality, including female pleasure, in language that acknowledged its reality rather than pretending it did not exist. She was, according to the scholars who have studied her medical writings in depth, one of the earliest scientific writers in European history to discuss gynecology from a genuinely female perspective. There's only one other female medical writer from the entire medieval period whose work survives with any completeness. 1. Hildegard was for centuries an almost solitary voice. Now, if that were the whole of her life's work, it would already be extraordinary. But we have not yet talked about the music, and the music is in many ways the thing that most reveals who Hildegard actually was not as a theologian, not as a physician, but as a person. Over the course of her life, Hildegard composed 69 musical works, hymns, antiphons, sequences, responsories, each with its own original text written entirely by her. 69 compositions. To put that in context, there are more surviving musical compositions by Hildegard of Bingen than by any other single composer from the entire High Middle Ages, more than any other composer, of any kind, male or female, from a woman who was technically not permitted to preach or teach men. And the music itself is unlike anything else from its period. Medieval chant, the standard form of liturgical music in the 12th century, was typically restrained in its melodic range, controlled, narrow intervals, designed for congregational singing by a community. Hildegard's music soars. The melodic lines in her compositions are described by musicologists as expansive, ecstatic, almost rapturous, reaching up and out in ways that traditional Gregorian chant rarely attempted. Some passages span more than 2 octaves. The music matches the visions, it does not stay where it is told to stay. Her most ambitious musical work, the Ordo Virtutum, the Order of the Virtues, is a morality play in which virtues and vices battle for a human soul, with all characters played and sung by nuns. It is, according to music historians, the oldest known surviving morality play in Western history. Written by a nun, performed by nuns, in a convent in the Rhine Valley in 1151, and then, and I have been saving this because I genuinely love this detail, the language. Sometime between 1150 and 1158, Hildegard invented a language, her own language, from nothing. In the middle of everything else she was doing, she called it the lingua ignota, the unknown language. It consisted of 1011 words organized hierarchically from the most divine to the most mundane. In her language, the word for God is eigons. The word for angel is eigens. The word for devil, and I appreciate that she included the devil in her language, is duelis. The word for duck is luscia. She also created a corresponding alphabet, 23 symbols, each representing a letter which she called the litterae ignotae, the unknown letters. Why did she do it? Scholars still argue about this. Some believe it was a mystical language, the tongue of angels, or perhaps the perfect language of Adam before the fall. Some believe it was a form of cryptography used to communicate privately with her nuns in a way that outsiders could not read. Some believe it was a theological exercise, a way of creating new words for concepts that Latin could not fully capture. The most likely truth is probably all of these things simultaneously. What it was not in any reading was trivial. Hildegard created a language, a structured, documented, surviving language, hundreds of years before anyone in the popular imagination began doing such things. She is in the most literal historical sense the founder of a tradition of constructed languages that runs through the next 9 centuries right up to the present day. If you have ever played a game or watched a film where someone spent years creating a fictional language for a world they invented, they are, whether they know it or not, working in a tradition that Hildegard of Bingen began. Now I want to share something personal here because I think it matters. I have read a great deal about Hildegard in the process of preparing this story, and the thing that strikes me most, more than the visions, more than the medicine, more than the music, is a single exchange of letters. Hildegard wrote more than 400 letters over her lifetime, to popes, to emperors, to abbesses, to ordinary people seeking spiritual counsel. One of her letters was to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick I, Frederick the Great Bearded, the most powerful political figure in Europe. Hildegard wrote to him as an equal, more than an equal. She wrote to him as someone whose spiritual authority superseded his political authority, and she told him with the particular courteous bluntness that characterized her entire life that he was making poor decisions and needed to reconsider. The emperor wrote back, not to dismiss her, to engage with what she had said, and he later told her in another letter that the prophecies she had made concerning his reign had all come to pass. A woman locked behind convent walls with no army, no title, no legal standing in any court corresponding with the most powerful man in Europe, as if they were intellectual colleagues. Because in every way that actually mattered they were. Hildegard died in 1179 at the age of 81, which in 12th century terms was an extraordinarily long life, long enough to finish 3 major volumes of visionary theology, 2 books of medicine and natural history, 69 musical compositions, 1 morality, play 1 complete invented language and alphabet, more than 400 letters and 2 functioning convents, all from inside the walls of religious life, all from within the boundaries and sometimes at the extreme edges of what a medieval woman was permitted to do. There's a phrase I keep returning to when I think about Hildegard. She described herself at the beginning of Scivias as a feather carried on the breath of God, and I think she meant it sincerely. But I also think there is an irony in that image that she may or may not have intended. A feather does not direct itself. A feather is passive light carried wherever the wind takes it. But Hildegard of Bingen was not passive. She was one of the most aggressively, persistently, brilliantly productive human beings of the entire medieval period. She did not float on a divine wind. She pointed herself directly into it and flew. And here is the quiet, unsettling question that follows from everything we have talked about. How many Hildegards were there whose names we do not know? How many women in those stone convents, in those cold dormitories, at those silent refectory tables had the same fire, the same hunger, the same capacity, and simply lacked the specific combination of circumstances, connections, and extraordinary luck that gave Hildegard her opening? We will never know, because they did not have the papal permission she had, because they did not have the noble family connections she had, because they did not have the specific monk confessor who believed in them the way Volmar believed in Hildegard. Their work, if they did any, was not preserved. Their names were not recorded. Their languages, if they invented any, are gone. The history we have is only the history that survived, and what survived was only a fraction of what existed. The full story of medieval women, and what they thought and created and said to each other in those long, quiet centuries between the ringing of the bells, that story is mostly silence, which makes what Hildegard left behind even more extraordinary. Because it proves the silence was not emptiness, it was fullness that was simply never written down. But even as women of extraordinary intellect were shaping European thought from inside the cloister, something else entirely was happening inside those walls, something that the Church talked about in hushed tones, that the bishops recorded in careful coded language, that the Inquisition files documented with a mix of horror and fascination, because not everyone in those convents was writing music and inventing languages. Some of them were doing something that the official record tried very hard to minimize, to contain, and when possible to erase entirely. And those stories, the ones that were almost lost, are some of the most human, the most complex and the most thought-provoking in this entire long history of life behind the veil. Something has been sitting at the edge of this story since we began, and I think it is time to walk directly toward it, because there is a version of medieval convent life that gets told quite often, the one with the bells and the prayers and the manuscripts and the gardens, the orderly version, the institutional version, the one where everyone is quietly holy, quietly productive, and quietly at peace. And then there is the version that lives in the actual historical record, in the episcopal visitation reports, in the confessor's notes, in the Inquisition files, in the letters that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the walls. And that version is considerably more complicated and considerably more human. Let us start with something that surprises most people when they first encounter it: food. We talked in an earlier part of this series about the diet inside a medieval convent, the bread, the beer, the vegetable soup, the enforced silence at mealtimes, the rule of St. Benedict's carefully moderated approach to nourishment. But there is a whole other dimension to food in medieval religious women's lives that we have not touched yet, and it is one of the most psychologically fascinating and frankly heartbreaking chapters in this entire history. The medieval historian Caroline Walker Bynum, in her landmark study from 1988, described a phenomenon that she called the religious significance of food to medieval women. And what she found in studying the lives and writings of religious women from 1200 to 1500 across Western Europe was that food held a significance for these women that went far beyond nutrition or even spiritual discipline. Food was power. Control over food specifically, the refusal of it, was one of the very few forms of agency that many medieval women could exercise over their own bodies and their own public identities. The formal term for this practice is anorexia mirabilis, which translates with a combination of beauty and tragedy as miraculous loss of appetite. It described something that became in the 13th and 14th centuries not merely tolerated but actively celebrated in religious communities: women who ate almost nothing, who survived apparently on almost no food at all, whose extreme fasting was interpreted not as illness but as holiness. The most famous example is Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347 in Tuscany, the 24th child of a dyer, Catherine began fasting as a teenager as a form of protest. Her family wanted to marry her to her late sister's husband, and Catherine refused, using the one tool she had, her body. She stopped eating. Not entirely at first, but progressively, radically, with a totality that the people around her found either miraculous or terrifying, depending on who they were. By the last years of her life, Catherine reportedly subsisted almost entirely on the Eucharist, the consecrated wafer received at Mass and water. She died in 1380 at 33 years old, from what modern medical scholars describe without much ambiguity as starvation, and she was venerated for it. Pilgrims came to watch her fast. She was held up as a model of female piety. She was eventually made a Doctor of the Church, one of the most prestigious titles in Catholic theology, awarded to people whose writing and thinking have shaped the Church's understanding of itself. A woman who died of starvation in her early 30s is now formally recognized as one of the greatest theological minds in Catholic history. I find it impossible to think about Catherine of Siena without feeling the full weight of that contradiction. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that reduces these women to victims, that says they were starving themselves, they were ill, they were suffering, and the people around them were too blinded by religious ideology to see what was happening. And that is part of the truth, but it is not the whole truth. Bynum's research makes a compelling argument that these women were doing something more complex than simply suffering. For many of them, the control over food in a world where they controlled almost nothing was a genuine form of power. The woman who refused to eat had paradoxically authority over her own body, in a way that married women and noble women, even queens, often did not. She could not be married off by her family if she was considered a living saint. She could not be dismissed as spiritually unreliable if crowds were coming to witness her fasting. She had, through the extreme manipulation of her own body, carved out a space of absolute personal sovereignty. Catherine of Siena, who ate almost nothing, wrote letters that influenced popes. She travelled. She preached. She was consulted on international ecclesiastical politics. Could she have done any of that as a normal married woman in 14th century Tuscany? Almost certainly not. Is that horrifying? Yes. Is it also remarkable? Yes. Both things are true simultaneously. And Catherine was not alone. Marie of Ossier, who died in 1213, refused all food except hardened stale bread, specifically chosen because it was hard enough to tear the skin of her mouth when she chewed it. She wanted to suffer like Christ suffered. She wanted the pain to be real. Angela of Foligno, a 13th century mystic, went further still in ways I will describe carefully, because I want to be honest about how extreme this could get. Angela reportedly ate the crust of wounds from the bodies of the sick she tended, wanting to identify so completely with human suffering that even disgust became a form of devotion. Were these women holy? Were they ill? Were they profoundly, creatively, desperately trying to make meaning in circumstances that gave them almost no other tools? I think the honest answer is all three. But here is what I find most revealing about the food practices inside medieval convents, not just the extreme asceticism, but the whole spectrum. Because for every woman who refused to eat, there were others who did the opposite. The monastic brewing traditions of medieval Europe were in large part built by women. The surnames maltster and brewster, the medieval English words for people who made malt and brewed ale, are in the female grammatical form, because homebrewing for most of the medieval period was women's work, and convents were among the most sophisticated brewing operations in medieval Europe. A large convent, a well-resourced Benedictine or Cistercian house, with substantial land would maintain dedicated buildings for the entire brewing process. The malting of grain, the grinding, the boiling, the fermentation. And the beer that came out of those buildings was not just the thin, watery breakfast drink I described earlier. Some convents produced ales flavoured with rosemary, fennel, yarrow, chamomile, and sage, the same herbs growing in the kitchen garden that serve both medical and culinary purposes. Some produced wines from grapes grown on south-facing convent slopes. Some produced what we might call herbal liqueurs, concentrated plant extractions, that had both medicinal and, let us say, recreational applications. And here is a detail I cannot resist sharing. The convent garden at Rupertsberg Hildegard of Bingen's own convent was documented as one of the most extensive herb gardens in the Rhine Valley, and Hildegard herself in her medical writings documented the use of fennel, lavender, tansy, and various other herbs in ways that were both therapeutic and used in the production of flavoured drinks. The woman who wrote Theology, approved by the Pope, invented her own language, composed 69 musical works, and wrote the first herbal medicine text authored by a woman also knew her way around the brew house. I cannot tell you how satisfying I find that. Now let us shift from what entered the body to what the body was made to endure. Because alongside the extreme fasting, there was another tradition inside medieval convents that was equally widespread and equally complicated to look at honestly. Mortification of the flesh, the deliberate infliction of physical discomfort or pain on oneself as a form of spiritual discipline and identification with Christ's suffering. This ranged from the relatively mild wearing rough wool habits directly against the skin, going barefoot on cold stone floors, maintaining uncomfortable postures during long prayer services, to the severe. Hair shirts, garments woven from rough animal hair worn next to the skin, under the regular habit designed to cause constant low-level discomfort. St. Thomas More famously wore one under his lawyer's robes in 15th century England. Many medieval nuns wore them routinely. Flagellation and the ritual use of a small whip or discipline to strike oneself practiced in many orders as a form of penitential prayer. Particularly common in the 13th and 14th centuries, when a wave of mystical devotion swept through European convents that emphasized direct bodily identification with Christ's passion, and sleeping arrangements that were deliberately uncomfortable, not merely the straw mattress and the thin blanket, but in some cases thorns or boards, chosen specifically because they made rest difficult. Now here is where I want to offer my own honest perspective, because I think it matters. It is very easy from the comfortable vantage point of the 21st century to look at these practices and see only suffering, only damage, only the cruel imposition of a patriarchal theology on women's bodies. And again, that's part of the truth. But the historical record also tells us that many of the women who practice these disciplines describe them genuinely in their own words as a source of profound meaning, not as punishment, as participation. The medieval theology of the body that underpinned these practices understood physical suffering not as something to be endured despite its meaninglessness, but as a form of communion with the suffering of Christ. If you believed truly in your bones, believed that the God who had made everything had come into the world in a human body, and allowed that body to be tortured and broken, then deliberately sharing in physical suffering was not masochism. It was an act of love. I do not share this belief myself, but I think we owe these women the respect of taking their own account of their experience seriously rather than reducing them entirely to victims of a system they had no part in creating. Many of them were simultaneously creating it, and then alongside all of this there was the body in its most everyday ordinary dimension, simply getting sick. Because inside those walls illness was constant, medieval life expectancy was significantly lower than our own. Infectious disease moved quickly through closed communities, and the combination of interrupted sleep, cold dormitories, fasting seasons, and physical labour created conditions that wore bodies down steadily over years. The infirmary was one of the most important buildings in a convent, and the nuns who staffed it were doing serious medical work, not just prayer and comfort, but actual treatment, herbal preparations, wound care, diagnosis. The same knowledge base that Hildegard had documented so brilliantly was being applied practically every day in convent infirmaries across Europe. Many convents also opened their infirmaries to the surrounding community, offering medical care to lay people who came to the gates seeking help. This was both an act of genuine charity and, practically speaking, an important source of community goodwill and donations. The medieval historian Barbara Tuchman estimated that in the decades of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, when perhaps a third of Europe's population died in roughly 4 years, convents and monasteries provided the closest thing to organised medical care that existed anywhere. Nuns staffed the hospitals, nuns prepared the medicines, nuns tended the dying. In the middle of the worst catastrophe in European history, the women who had supposedly retreated from the world were in many cases the last line of care between ordinary people and death. Which brings me to something I want to say directly. The more I have sat with this material, the fasting, the discipline, the brewing, the infirmaries, the visions, the silence, the more I find myself pushing back against one particular idea that runs through a lot of popular history. The idea that medieval convent life was fundamentally about the suppression of women. That these institutions were simply elaborate mechanisms for controlling female bodies and female minds in service of a patriarchal church and a patriarchal society. That is true. Parts of it are absolutely true. But it is not the whole story. Because the women inside those walls were not passive. They were not simply subjected to the system. They were also constantly and creatively working within it, using its tools, finding the gaps, pushing the edges. The woman who fasted to the point of sainthood was using the body as a political instrument. The abbess who managed a property empire was using institutional authority as effectively as any male feudal lord. The nun who composed music that soared beyond the ranges prescribed for women's voices was doing something technically within the rules that was also completely quietly, magnificently transgressive. And all of those women were also genuinely trying to live lives of spiritual depth, trying to be good, to be whole, to be close to whatever they believed was at the centre of everything. The complexity of that, the impossible tangle of constraint and agency suffering and meaning coercion and genuine vocation, is what makes this history worth spending a whole night with. But I've been dancing around a particular corner of this story for a while now. The corner that the Church was most anxious about. The corner that the episcopal visitation records tried to handle with maximum discretion. The corner that produced some of the most dramatic and disturbing cases in the entire medieval record. What happened when the walls that were supposed to protect everyone inside became the walls that trapped them? What happened when the discipline broke not gradually but suddenly violently, with consequences that reverberated far beyond the convent gate? What happened, in other words, when the human beings inside those stone walls simply could no longer be contained by them? That is exactly where we are heading next. Let me tell you about a woman named Joan of Leeds. She was a Benedictine nun at the Priory of St. Clement just outside the city of York in northern England. We do not know how old she was when she entered perhaps her early teens, as was common. We do not know whether she chose the life or was placed there by her family. We do not know what her days felt like year after year behind those same stone walls. What we do know is that at some point in the early 14th century, Joan of Leeds decided she was done. Not in a quiet way, not by simply walking out one night and hoping nobody noticed. Joan of Leeds faked her own death. She staged an illness convincing enough to fool the community. She arranged with what the Archbishop would later describe with magnificent outrages, numerous accomplices and evildoers, for a dummy to be constructed in the likeness of her body. She had this dummy buried in the convent graveyard, in sacred ground, among the graves of her sisters, and then she walked out. We know this story because of a letter written in 1318 by Archbishop William Melton of York, who had heard a disturbing rumour that Joan had turned up alive and well in the nearby town of Beverley, and who was absolutely furious about it. His letter is honestly one of my favourite documents from the entire medieval period, not because of the legal content, because of the language. The Archbishop wrote that Joan had turned her back on decency and the good of religion, had been seduced by indecency, and had involved herself irreverently and pervertedly in, and I am using his phrase, the way of carnal lust, and away from poverty and obedience. She now wandered at large, he concluded dramatically, to the notorious peril to her soul, and to the scandal of all of her order, the way of carnal lust, wandering at large. I have to admit that there is a part of me, however historically minded I try to be, that quietly, privately cheers for Joan of Leeds. She built a dummy of herself, buried it in a churchyard, and went to live her life. That is not a small thing. That took planning, courage, help, and apparently a remarkable talent for theatrical deception. Whether she was ever caught and returned, the historical record does not tell us. The Archbishop's letter is the last we hear of her, and I find something beautiful in that. Joan of Leeds remains 9 centuries later a small mystery, wandering at large. Now, Joan was not an isolated case, not even close. The episcopal registers, the official records kept by medieval bishops across England, are full of stories like hers, some dramatic, some heartbreaking, some that read frankly like they belong in a medieval comedy. In 1300, 3 nuns from Delapré Abbey in Northampton, Isabella Clouville, Matilda de Thichemes, and Ermentrude de Newark, all fled at the same time, 3 of them, together. The bishop recorded his disappointment with an almost poignant formality. Agnes de Flixthorpe, a nun of St. Michael's in Stamford, ran away from her convent at least 3 times over the course of several years. On one occasion she was found dressed in a man's gilt-embroidered robe. She consistently maintained that she had never been legitimately professed as a nun in the first place, that her vows had been taken under duress, and that she was legally married to a man she refused to name. The Bishop of Lincoln branded her an apostate, sent secular authorities to imprison her, eventually excommunicated her. Agnes ran away again. Now here is where I want to slow down and think carefully. Because these stories, the runaway nuns, the apostates, the women who fled, are easy to read as straightforward tales of resistance. Women escaping from captivity, heroes of their own story. And sometimes that is exactly what they were. But the historical picture is more complicated, because the scholar Elizabeth Makowski, who wrote what is currently the definitive study of apostate nuns in the later Middle Ages, makes a point that I think is genuinely important. For monks who were unhappy with monastic life, the Church had a relatively accessible path out. A monk could under certain circumstances receive dispensation from his vows and return to secular life holding a church, benefice, a form of paid ecclesiastical position that allowed a former monk to live respectably outside the monastery. For nuns, no such option existed. Once a woman had taken solemn vows, the law offered her nothing. No dispensation, no dignified exit, no face-saving alternative. She stayed. Or she became an apostate, automatically excommunicated, her immortal soul placed in theoretical jeopardy, her name recorded in the bishop's register as a criminal and a fugitive. The asymmetry is stunning. Men who left were sometimes given legal alternatives. Women who left were hunted. So the nuns who ran were not merely following their hearts. They were making a decision that by the standards of their world placed everything at risk: social standing, legal protection, spiritual salvation. That is not impulsiveness. That is desperation or courage or both. And then there were the women who did not run, who stayed behind the walls year after year and found other ways to push back. The episcopal visitation records are full of them too. Eudes Rigaud, Archbishop of Rouen in France, visited numerous convents in his diocese between 1249 and 1265 and kept meticulous notes about what he found. He wrote up nuns for faults ranging from, and I am quoting these directly because they are perfect, singing the hours with too much haste, wearing costly furs of rabbits' hairs and foxes over their habits, to drunkenness and conduct that scandalize their communities. Too much haste in singing the hours. I find that one particularly charming. Somewhere in 13th century Normandy, a group of nuns were collectively speeding through matins because they wanted to get back to bed. And the Archbishop wrote it down. English visitation records from the same period tell similarly vivid stories. At Cannington in 1351, in addition to a cash-hungry prioress and a lazy sub-prioress who was documented as regularly missing matins, also a wonderfully relatable failure. A nun named Joan Trimolet was found to be pregnant. The bishop's commissioner recorded this discovery with the memorable annotation, "Not indeed by the Holy Ghost." That is an actual quote from an actual episcopal register. A 14th century bishop's official wrote in formal Latin, "Not indeed by the Holy Ghost." Medieval records, when they get going, are genuinely remarkable. Bishop Arnwick's 1442 visitation of Catesby Priory in Northamptonshire revealed a community in a state of what I can only describe as comprehensive disorder. The prioress Margaret Waver and one of her senior nuns, Isabel Benet, were engaged in a running feud that had apparently divided the entire community. They were accusing each other of various forms of misconduct. Other nuns were giving testimony about both of them, some commenting on their impropriety, while others, more practically minded, were focusing their complaints on the prioress's poor management of convent finances and her habit of sowing discord among the sisters. And then there was the detail that I cannot get past. One of the nuns told the bishop that Isabel Benet had recently passed the night at the Austin Friars in Northampton, dancing and playing the lute with them until midnight, dancing and playing the lute with the friars until midnight, in a convent that was supposed to observe the Great Silence from Compline onward. I want to know so much more about Isabel Benet. I want to know what song she played. I want to know if she was any good. Now, behind all of these individual stories, the escaped nuns, the lute-playing rule-breakers, the dogs and the fox-fur polices and the midnight dancing, there is a structural reality that I think matters more than any individual case. The medieval scholar Eileen Power, whose work on English nunneries in the 13th and 14th centuries remains some of the most detailed, we have found something consistent across dozens of episcopal visitation records from convents throughout England. The violations were almost never random. They followed patterns, and those patterns tracked closely with the nature of how individual women had entered the convent in the first place. Convents where a significant proportion of the community had been placed there by their families, where many of the women had no genuine religious vocation, tended to have far more friction, more rule-breaking, more conflict between individuals, more of the small daily resistances that show up in visitation records as excessive gossiping, keeping unauthorized pets wearing fashionable clothes under or over the habit, maintaining private friendships that excluded others, and general inability to sustain the communal spirit the rule of Benedict required. This makes complete sense if you think about it. A community of women who had genuinely chosen this life, who had internalized its values, who had come to it with their own spiritual conviction, had an internal motivation to keep the rules. Not because they were forced to, but because the rules reflected what they actually believed. A community of women where half or more had been placed there without choice had no such internal motivation. They were following rules imposed from outside, and human beings, when subjected to rules they have not chosen for reasons they do not share, find ways to resist them. Small ways, daily ways. The way a community of people always resists a system that does not fit who they actually are. Can I ask you something? Because I have been thinking about this as I've worked through these materials. When you hear these stories, the faked death, the lute player, the nuns in fox fur, the 3 women who escaped together in the dark, what do you feel? I think most of us feel something that is genuinely hard to name. It is not quite admiration, though there is some of that. It is not quite sympathy, though there is plenty of that too. It is something more like recognition. The recognition that the people in these records were doing exactly what people do when they are placed in circumstances that do not fit them. They bend the rules at the edges. They find the gaps. They form alliances. They keep small pieces of their former selves hidden, a piece of jewellery, a dancing lesson, a dog they were not supposed to have as proof that whatever the institution said about them, they were still themselves. That impulse is not unique to medieval nuns. It is not unique to any era. It is one of the most persistently, stubbornly human things there is. And yet, and here is the part that complicates everything, as the best history always does. For every nun who ran there were many, many more who stayed. And not all of them stayed because they had no choice. In 1339, Henry VIII's commissioners arrived at Denny Abbey in Cambridgeshire, one of the convents scheduled for dissolution as part of his systematic dismantling of the English Church. When they arrived, they found, as the records document, 6 tearful nuns who wanted immediate release from their vows. Evidence certainly that many medieval nuns lacked a genuine vocation. But then 5 years later, when the abbey was formally closed, the Abbess Elizabeth Throckmorton refused to simply accept the ending. She gathered 2 or more of her nuns retired to her family's manor house at Cowton Court in Warwickshire, and there in a private house in the English countryside they continued to live according to their monastic vows, wearing their habits, keeping their prayers. Long after the institution that had housed them had been dissolved by royal decree. 4 nuns of Kirklees Priory in West Yorkshire did the same thing, forming a small quasi-monastic community at a nearby manor house after their convent was closed. The entire community of Sion Abbey went into exile abroad rather than abandon their vows. and they maintained their identity as a religious community with an unbroken documented institutional thread until the year 2011. Think about that. A religious community that traced its continuous existence from the medieval period to within living memory, because a group of women refused to stop being what they had chosen to be, even when the world around them made it illegal. So we have two kinds of women in this story, and they are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same thing. The women who ran were asserting the self. The women who stayed, the ones who genuinely stayed by choice, were also asserting the self. They were saying, "This is who I am, and nobody gets to take that away." The tragedy of medieval convent history is not that some women were unhappy in those walls. The tragedy is that the system made it almost impossible to tell from the outside which women had chosen this and which women had not, until the bishop arrived with his register, until the record was made, until the stories we are still reading 9 centuries later found their way into the books. But the most unsettling stories, the ones that reveal not just individual resistance, but something more systemic, more deliberately hidden, those came not from the nuns who fled. They came from the ones who stayed, from the reports that were sealed, the investigations that went nowhere, the cases that were resolved internally in ways that left the women involved with no recourse, no court to appeal to, and no record that anything had happened at all. Because the church was very, very good at protecting itself. And that part of the story, the part that lived in the shadows, in the sealed files, in the coded language of Inquisition records, is exactly where we are going next. There is something that has been running quietly underneath everything we have talked about so far. We covered the women who escaped through locked gates, the ones who built dummies and fooled entire convents, the ones who played lute until midnight and kept unauthorized rabbits and wore fox fur under their habits, and generally made the bishop's register a far more entertaining document than it had any right to be. All of that was visible resistance. It had paper trails, it had records, it had furious archbishops writing letters about it. But there was another form of resistance entirely, one that left a different kind of record, one that the institution struggled to categorize, to contain, and ultimately in certain cases to survive. That was the resistance that happened on the inside, in the mind, in the long hours of prayer, in the small still voice that only one person could hear. Here is the fundamental problem that the medieval church had with women. Women were not permitted to preach, not permitted to interpret scripture publicly, not permitted to teach theology, not permitted to hold any formal position of intellectual or spiritual authority over men, or even over other women outside their own communities. A female professor of theology in 12th century Paris impossible. A woman standing at the pulpit of a cathedral to deliver a sermon unthinkable. A woman claiming that she understood God better than the bishop surrounding her. That was the straightest possible road to a heresy charge. And then there was a loophole, a narrow door in all of that stone. If God spoke to you directly, if the divine made itself known to you through visions, through ecstasies, through revelations, who exactly could tell you not to report what you had seen? You were not preaching. You were witnessing. You were not teaching. You were transcribing. The words were not yours. You were simply the instrument through which they passed, and an instrument, however lowly, however female, could not be silenced, when what was flowing through it was the voice of God himself. Medieval women mystics discovered this, not all at once, not as a calculated strategy, at least not initially, but over generations, across centuries, a pattern formed. If you want to speak in a world that will not let you, you need a speaker with more authority than anyone who might silence you. And in medieval Europe, nothing outranked God. Let me tell you about a woman whose name we do not even know for certain. We call her Julian. Whether that was her given name or simply the name of the church she lived beside, the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, nobody knows. born around the year 1342, into a city that had recently endured the Black Death, which killed roughly 1/3 of Norwich's population in the space of a few devastating years. Julian survived it, though she almost certainly lost people she loved. When she was 30 years old, on the 13th of May in the year 1373, she fell gravely ill. Her family and her priest believed she was dying. Her sight began to fail. Her breath grew shallow. The priest held a crucifix before her face so she could focus on it in her final moments. And then in the middle of that apparent dying, she saw something. 16 visions. She called them shewings, showings, revelations, all of them centered on the passion of Christ. Blood flowing from the crown of thorns, the texture of the suffering made almost unbearably specific and physical, and woven through all of it something she described as almost impossible to hold, in language a sense of love so complete, so unconditional, so final, that it encompassed everything she'd ever feared. She recovered from the illness, and she wrote down what she had seen, not once, twice. First, a short account written shortly after the experience. Then, approximately 20 years later, a longer version revised deepened the product of 2 decades of solitary prayer and theological reflection on what those 16 visions might mean. That second longer version is the earliest surviving book in the English language written by a woman. Can I ask you something genuinely? When you think about the first book written in English by a woman, what did you expect it to be? A poem, a story, something domestic perhaps, something personal? What it actually is a work of systematic theology, a careful, rigorous, intellectually demanding attempt to understand the nature of divine love, written by a woman whose real name we do not know, who lived sealed inside a small stone cell attached to a church, who received her food through a small window, who never left that cell, and from that cell she wrote this, now one of the most quoted sentences in all of English literature: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. 8 centuries later, people put that phrase on coffee mugs and phone wallpapers, not because it is cheerful, although it is, but because it contains something true, an assurance built not from naivety, but from a woman who had watched plague empty her city and still found somewhere in the ruins of that experience a foundation that held. Julian's theology, when you read it carefully, is quietly radical. She described God as a mother, not metaphorically, not as a passing image, but as a sustained theological claim. She wrote our Lord Jesus Christ may also be called our mother. He is our mother of mercy in taking our created nature. He is our mother of grace in taking flesh. In the 14th century, in Catholic England, with heresy trials happening around her throughout her lifetime. No man in the Latin tradition could have written that and survived. Julian wrote it and it survived because she had learned the precise grammar of visionary language. She did not claim it was her idea. It was what God had shown her. You cannot charge the messenger with authoring the message. Now set Julian beside the other great English mystic of her generation, a woman named Margery Kemp. And if Julian is the quiet contemplative face of medieval female mysticism, Margery is the loud, chaotic, magnificent, exasperating other face. Margery was born in the same year as Julian, 1373. She married. She had at least 14 children. 14. She ran a brewing business unsuccessfully, and then a mill, also unsuccessfully. After the birth of her first child, she spent nearly 8 months in what sounds, by any honest description, like a severe mental health crisis. She heard voices she described as demons. She experienced visions she could not control. And in the depth of it, she claimed Christ appeared to her and said, "Daughter, why have you forsaken me when I never forsook you?" The visions never entirely stopped after that. When she was around 40, Margery negotiated a celibate marriage with her husband, a formal agreement witnessed and recorded, and spent the rest of her life going on pilgrimages. She went to Rome. She went to the Holy Land. She went to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She visited shrines and abbeys and holy sites across Europe, and everywhere she went she wept. Not discreet, decorous tears, loud, chest-heaving, full-body sobbing. She rolled on the ground. She screamed. She explained to everyone nearby that this was the Holy Spirit working in her. Can you imagine being in Margery Kemp's pilgrimage group? Her fellow travellers reportedly prayed that she would travel on a different ship. A priest in Leicester called her a false strumpet and a liar. She was arrested for heresy not once but multiple times, and acquitted each time because the judges, however, irritated and embarrassed, could not find anything actually wrong with what she said about faith. Now here is what Margery did that matters most to this story. Sometime in the 1420s, Margery Kemp, who could not read or write, dictated her life story to a scribe. That book, known today simply as the Book of Margery Kemp, is the first autobiography written in the English language. Let that land for a moment. The first autobiography in English, not by a king, not by a philosopher or a poet, by a failed businesswoman from Norfolk, mother of 14, who cried uncontrollably in public across 3 continents and kept getting arrested for what she believed God was doing through her body. And we know she visited Julian of Norwich, directly travelled to the anchoress's cell in Norwich to seek advice about her visions. We know they spent several days together in conversation. 2 women, 2 completely different styles of spiritual experience, one entirely hidden and still, one entirely public and turbulent, sitting together discussing the nature of divine revelation. What I would not give to have been a third person in that room. Now I need to say something careful here, because the 21st century mind naturally wants to ask what were these women actually experiencing, and the honest answer is that we cannot know, and I think the even more honest answer is that the question itself may be the wrong question for this particular history. What Julian described, the flooding light, the close-textured vision of blood and wound, the overwhelming wave of unconditional love, could have been genuine mystical experience. It could have been neurological phenomena associated with near-death illness. It could have been both at once. What Margery experienced, the episodes of uncontrollable weeping, the intense sense of divine presence, the voices and visions that structured her entire adult life, could have been deeply real spiritual encounter. Or it could be that if Margery Kemp were alive today, a contemporary clinical psychologist might have observations to offer that the 14th century simply had no language for. The point is this: in the medieval world, those 2 possibilities were not separable. There was no distinction between theology and psychology, between faith and what we would now call mental health, between what you experienced and what God was doing to you. And in that indistinguishable space, women found their voices, but those voices were always precarious. The scholar Jean Gerson, Chancellor of the University of Paris in the late 14th century, put the problem with characteristic bluntness. He wrote that women were more susceptible to deception than men, more easily led astray, more influenced by emotion and body than by reason. What they described as divine vision was not necessarily divine. It might come from somewhere else entirely. He wanted to create a permanent office of the Inquisition, specifically to investigate mystics and verify their visions. That policy, the formal discernment of spirits, became the Church's standard mechanism for managing women visionaries, and the pattern in the outcomes is stark. Hildegard of Bingen, who always placed herself under Church supervision and wrote within recognisably orthodox frameworks, approved. Julian of Norwich, who chose her words with extreme care, and constantly subordinated her claims to ecclesiastical authority tolerated in silence. Margery Kemp, who was loud and reckless and impossible to manage, arrested repeatedly but never convicted. And then there was Marguerite Porete, a French beguine who wrote a text called The Mirror of Simple Souls, describing a soul that transcended all mediation, all institutional structures, all need for priests or sacraments to achieve direct union with God. No church needed, no hierarchy between the soul and the divine. She was burned in Paris in 1310. She refused to recant even given multiple opportunities. She died in the flames and her book was condemned, and her book survived anyway, copied, secretly circulated among women in religious communities across Europe for 2 centuries after her death, because the women who read it recognized something in it. Here is the contradiction I keep coming back to. Women were presumed to be spiritually weaker than men, more susceptible to deception, less capable of sound judgment, more physical, more emotional, less rational. And then, and this is the part that still stuns me when I think about it clearly, that very presumed weakness became the basis of their authority. Because if women were merely vessels, if they were not strong or rational enough to generate theological ideas of their own, then anything of real value flowing through them must be coming from somewhere outside them, which meant if what they said was worthy, it had to be God speaking. The presumed incapacity of women became the proof of their vision's authenticity. That is the most remarkable circular logic in the entire history of religious thought. And Julian, working in her stone cell with a cat and a window, understood it completely. She never claimed to be smart. She described herself as a simple, unlettered woman. She never claimed authority. She claimed she was merely reporting what she'd been shown. She never pushed against the edges of the institution. She simply described what she had seen, and what she had seen happened to include a God who was also mother, and a universe in which all shall be well. And the church could not touch her for it, because none of it was her fault. She was just the instrument. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to sit with before we move to the chapter that follows. The medieval historian Diane Elliott, in her landmark study of female spirituality and the Inquisition, traced a long, disturbing arc across the later Middle Ages. At the beginning of this period, the 12th and 13th centuries women mystics were largely celebrated. They were institutional assets, living proof of the Church's power and holiness. Pilgrims came to see them. Popes corresponded with them. Their visions were copied and distributed. By the end of the Middle Ages, the same phenomenon had become something to be feared. Female mystics were increasingly mistrusted, increasingly investigated, increasingly subjected to exactly the kind of inquisitorial scrutiny that Gerson had advocated. And Elliott argues that the mechanism developed to distinguish the holy mystic from the dangerous heretic eventually made those 2 categories so similar that almost any intensely religious woman could be reframed as the other. The saint and the heretic lived on the same spectrum. Which side of it you landed on depended heavily on whether the men around you found you useful or threatening. Julian was useful. She stayed in her cell and never challenged anyone directly. Margery was annoying but not threatening enough to burn. Marguerite Porete threatened the entire institutional structure. She burned. And a woman in early 17th century Tuscany, a woman who claimed divine visions, who called herself the Bride of Christ, who was elected abbess on the strength of her mystical reputation, was about to find out exactly which side of that line she was on. Her name was Benedetta Carlini, and her story began as so many of the stories in this series have begun, in a convent, in a sealed archive, in documents that sat untouched for 350 years before a historian found them by accident and brought them back to light. Somewhere in the Florentine State Archive there is a folder of documents that sat untouched for more than 350 years. It was labelled in the dry bureaucratic language of ecclesiastical record-keeping, with a description that translated roughly as a nun who pretended to be a mystic, but who was discovered to be a woman of ill repute. In 1981, a historian named Judith Brown was researching something entirely different: the Medici family, the banking dynasties of Renaissance Italy, when she came across this folder by accident. She opened it, and what she found inside changed the course of her career, produced a book that scholars have called one of the most important works in women's history, and brought back to life a story that the Church had spent nearly 4 centuries trying to keep buried. This is the story of Benedetta Carlini. Benedetta was born in 1590 in a small mountain village called Vegliano in Tuscany. She almost did not survive her own birth. Both she and her mother came close to death during labour, and her father, a devout man, attributed their survival to divine intervention. He named his daughter Benedetta, blessed. At age 9, she was sent to the Convent of the Mother of God in the small city of Pescia, not far from Florence. This was, as we've discussed throughout this series, entirely standard practice. A devout family, a daughter dedicated to God, a comfortable if austere life ahead of her. What nobody anticipated was what Benedetta Carlini would become. She was in her early 20s when the visions began. Or rather, and this distinction will matter enormously, later it was in her early 20s when the visions became known. Benedetta experienced ecstatic states during prayer. She fell into trances. She reported visions of Christ, of angels, of battles with demons. She claimed eventually to have received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ's crucifixion appearing on her hands and side. And then she claimed something that even in a world accustomed to female mystics crossed into genuinely extraordinary territory. She claimed that Christ had asked her to be his bride, not symbolically, not in the general theological sense in which all nuns were brides of Christ, but specifically, personally, with a ceremony. She organised a wedding in the chapel. The other nuns decorated the space according to her detailed instructions. On the appointed day, Benedetta went through the ceremony. Only she could see the groom. The community was divided. Some believed her completely, others were deeply sceptical. The church authorities began to investigate. Now, the medieval and early modern church had an elaborate procedure for investigating claims of mystical experience. It had to because the theological stakes were enormous. A genuine mystic, a woman directly touched by God, was spiritually and institutionally valuable. A fraudulent mystic was potentially heretical and deeply embarrassing. And there was an additional complication that Judith Brown describes in detail in her book. Female visionaries were regarded with particular suspicion, because the prevailing theology of the time held that women were more spiritually unstable than men, more susceptible to demonic deception, more easily misled by their own emotions and bodies. The 15th century theologian Jean Gerson had written explicitly that women were to be held suspect unless very carefully examined, because they were, in his phrase, easily seduced. So the investigation into Benedetta was shaped from the beginning by this fundamental institutional assumption. Whatever she claimed to experience, the first question was always whether it came from God or from somewhere far darker. The first investigation concluded in her favour. Her visions were validated. She was elected abbess of the convent in 1619. She began to preach, which was itself extraordinary, since public theological speech by women was considered deeply inappropriate, and people came from the surrounding countryside to witness the mystic who had married Christ. For a moment, Benedetta Carlini was exactly what the Church most valued: a living advertisement for the power of faith, a holy woman whose presence drew attention, devotion, and donation to her institution. And then came the second investigation. In 1622 and 1623 new concerns were raised. Questions about the authenticity of the visions, inconsistencies in the accounts, and something else, something that the investigator Stefano Cecchi initially approached with extreme caution and considerable discomfort testimony from Bartolomea Crivelli. Bartolomea was a younger nun who'd been assigned as Benedetta's companion. Her role was to be present during the periods of ecstasy to monitor Benedetta's condition to provide comfort and assistance. They shared a room separated only by curtains. What Bartolomea eventually testified to the investigators under oath under considerable pressure described something the Church had absolutely no established framework for handling. She said that Benedetta, during her claimed states of divine ecstasy, had crossed the curtain between their beds, that this had happened regularly over a period of at least 2 years, 3 nights or more a week, she estimated, that Benedetta had claimed to be acting under the direction of a male angel named Splenditello, that it was the angel not Benedetta herself who was present. The investigators were by the archival record genuinely thrown. Was this fraud? Was this demonic possession? Was this a deliberate manipulation of power by an abbess over a subordinate who had no ability to refuse her? Was it something else entirely? Something for which their entire theological and legal vocabulary had no adequate category? The case, as the historian Natalie Zeman-Davis observed, was a drama enacted on a stage of convent politics. Everything that was happening was filtered through the languages available in that time and place. There was no language for what Bartolomea was describing that was not either sacred or sinful. The investigators chose sinful. Benedetta, facing the full weight of the Inquisition's scrutiny, eventually confessed that she had been deceived by Satan, that the angel Splenditello had not been an angel at all, that she'd been misled, manipulated, corrupted. The framing was brilliant in its way, and I think it may have been partly deliberate. If she was willfully deceitful, she was a heretic, a fraudster, a serious criminal by the standards of her world. The punishments for that were severe. If she was the victim of demonic possession, if she had been manipulated by evil forces in the same way a ship might be caught in a storm, then she was tragic, perhaps pitiable, but ultimately a victim rather than a perpetrator. The investigators accepted the possession explanation. Benedetta was stripped of her position as abbess. She was confined to a cell within the convent, forbidden from speaking to her fellow nuns, and there she remained for 35 years. She died on the 7th of August 1661 at the age of 71 of fever and abdominal pain after 18 days of illness. Another nun recorded it in her diary simply, Benedetta Carlini died at age 71. She died in penitence, having spent 35 years in prison. Now I want to sit with this story for a moment, because it is dense with meaning, and the meaning shifts depending on where you stand. The Church's account was a fraud was uncovered, a deceiver was punished, the institutional order was maintained. The feminist historical account, the one Judith Brown presented so compellingly in her 1986 book, is the earliest documented case of female same-gender intimacy in modern Western history, a story that was suppressed for 3.5 centuries and which reveals the absolute impossibility of any honest, emotional or physical life for women locked inside those walls. But there is a third reading that I find equally compelling, and it is the one that asks the hardest question. The power imbalance in this story was not between Benedetta and the male church, not primarily. It was between Benedetta the abbess, the mystic, the person with institutional authority, and Bartolomea, the younger lower status nun who'd been assigned to her, who had no power to refuse, who slept in the same room, whose testimony when she finally gave it described force. Benedetta, whatever she was, visionary fraud woman navigating an impossible world, was also a person in a position of authority who who appears to have used that authority in ways that caused harm to someone more vulnerable. Both things can be true simultaneously. The oppression that shaped Benedetta's life does not cancel the harm she caused. The harm she caused does not cancel the oppression that shaped her life. History rarely gives us clean villains or pure victims. It gives us people under pressure making choices within constraints we can barely imagine. The Benedetta Carlini case is the most fully documented, most dramatic example of what the sealed files of medieval and early modern convents contain. But it is not unique in its essential shape. The scholar who compiled the episcopal visitation records of the Lincoln and Norwich dioceses analysed 391 reports from the late medieval period. In how many of those did cases of this kind get resolved publicly, transparently with full documentation? Almost none. The standard procedure, as the historical record shows with depressing consistency, was what one scholar described as discovery. Private investigation, silent removal, no civil involvement, no public record. The preservation of moral authority took priority over transparency, every single time, not because the Church was uniquely evil, because this is what institutions do when the alternative is public exposure of something that threatens their legitimacy. The medieval Church managed scandal the same way that many powerful institutions in many different eras have managed scandal, by keeping it internal, by making it disappear, by ensuring the people most affected had no external authority they could appeal to. Now, I want to be honest about something that I think needs to be said directly. Everything we have talked about in this part of the story, the sealed files, the internal investigations, the cases that never saw civil courts, is exactly what we might expect from any institution given total authority over a closed population with no independent oversight. That is not a statement about medieval religion specifically. It is a statement about what happens when accountability is removed from any institution of any kind in any era. The medieval convent was an extreme version of a problem that is not unique to the Middle Ages. Closed communities, total authority, no external accountability. The results in those conditions are depressingly predictable. And I say this not to condemn the women inside those walls, most of whom were navigating a situation they had not chosen, with the limited tools available to them, but to name clearly the structural conditions that made certain outcomes almost inevitable. And yet, and yet, and yet, and yet. Even in this darkest chapter of the story, even in the sealed files and the silent removals and the 35 years in a convent cell, there are moments of something that resists easy categorization. Benedetta Carlini died at 71, confined, forbidden to speak, cut off from the community she had led, and her funeral was attended by crowds of lay people from the surrounding countryside, people who had known her as the mystic abbess, who'd come to witness the woman they believed had married Christ, who did not know about the investigation or did not accept its conclusions. They came to say goodbye to someone they considered holy. Judith Brown, who spent years with Benedetta's documents, ends her account with a sentence that I find very hard to shake. She writes, "In the end, Benedetta triumphed." What does triumph mean in a life like that? What is victory when you die at 71 in a cell you entered at 36? I think Brown means something specific and something true. Benedetta's story survived. The Church tried to bury it in a folder in the State Archive of Florence, and 350 years later, a historian found it by accident and brought it back. This silence did not hold, and that perhaps is the most important thing to carry from all of this. The medieval Church was extraordinarily good at containing scandal, at managing information, at ensuring that what happened inside the walls stayed inside the walls, but not forever. The folders exist. The registers exist. The visitation records with their charges of fox fur pelisses and midnight lute playing exist. The Archbishop's furious letter about Joan of Leeds exists. Bartolommea's testimony exists. The diary entry recording Benedetta's death in prison after 35 years exists. The women who lived in those convents, the ones who are joyful there, the ones who are broken there, the ones who ran, and the ones who stayed, the ones who composed music and invented languages, and the ones who played lute until midnight, they all left traces. Not always the traces they intended, not always in the form they would have chosen, but the traces are there, and the story they tell when you put them all together is not a simple story of either holiness or horror. It is the story of human beings inside a system, doing what human beings do, surviving, resisting, sometimes transcending, sometimes failing, sometimes causing harm, sometimes receiving it, always unmistakably alive. So we've come a long way together in this story. From the gates that closed behind little girls through the ceremonies and the bells and the beer for breakfast, and the silent meals through the abbesses, who counselled emperors, and the mystics who invented languages through the sealed files, and the women who ran through the stories the church tried to bury, and the ones that survived anyway. But there is one question we have not yet answered directly, one that I think is actually the most important question of all. When the dissolution came, when Henry VIII closed the English convents, when the Reformation swept through northern Europe, when the institution itself began to end, what did the women inside those walls actually feel? Was it liberation? Was it loss? Was it both? And what did the world they returned to look like after years or decades inside those walls for the women who had known no other life? That is the question that closes this whole story. And it is more complicated than you might expect. The year is 1536. Imagine you are a woman, we will call her Margaret, though her real name is lost to us. She has lived inside the same stone walls for 23 years. She entered at 14, placed there by her family, and she is now 37. She knows every flagstone of this courtyard. She knows the exact pitch of the bell at matins, the way the morning light falls through the east window in summer, the particular smell of this kitchen on bread-baking days, the names and quirks and private sorrows of every one of her sisters. She has never voted. She has never owned property. She has almost certainly never been more than a few miles from this building in the entire adult life she can remember. This place is the whole world. And then one morning men arrive. They carry papers. They have soldiers with them. They tell Margaret and her sisters that the king has declared this house dissolved. They want a list of everything inside, every piece of plate, every book, every item of value. The convent is to be handed to the crown. Margaret has approximately 3 weeks to figure out where to go. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry VIII's commissioners shut down more than 800 religious houses across England, Wales and Ireland. Every single one. The abbeys and priories that had stood for 4 and 5 centuries. The institutions that had educated the daughters of the nobility, run the hospitals that served the poor, copied the manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge, and structured the devotional life of entire regions. Gone in the space of 4 years. Dismantled brick by brick, their lead roofs stripped and melted down, their libraries scattered, their art confiscated or destroyed, their communities dissolved. The immediate justification was corruption and immorality. Thomas Cromwell's commissioners had produced a document called the Comperta Monastica, a register of alleged scandals and misdeeds at monasteries across the country. No formal hearings were held. Parliament acted on the king's assurance that the reports were accurate. Many historians have since concluded that the Comperta was significantly exaggerated, designed to provide political cover for what was essentially a land grab of historic proportions. Monasteries owned over a quarter of all the cultivated land in England. Henry's treasury had been depleted by his lifestyle and his wars. The mathematics were not complicated, so what happened to women like Margaret? The short answer is it depended enormously on who you were and who you knew. The nuns of the larger houses, the great abbeys with wealthy founders and well-connected alumni received pensions. These averaged between £3 and £5 per year, £3 to £5. In the 1530s, that was considered a modest but survivable income for a single woman. Barely. Nuns who came from noble families, as many did, could return to their relatives. A woman from a wealthy household had somewhere to go, a father's manor house, a brother's estate, a network of family connections that could absorb her. But the nuns who came from smaller, poorer houses, the women who had entered with little and whose families had nothing to offer, had nowhere to go. No pension for those dissolved in the first wave of 1536, no property, no practical skills that the outside world valued, no experience of managing money, finding lodging, buying food. The records indicate that at least 1,500 to 2,000 nuns were dispersed across England during the dissolution, and the data on mortality rates in the decade that followed suggests they fared significantly worse than the monks. Because monks could be ordained as priests. They could take parish livings, hold benefices, continue their vocation in a different form. Nuns could do none of those things. During Henry's reign, they were not even permitted to marry. Their options were return to family, beg, enter domestic service, or find a way to keep living communally, which some did quietly in private households, continuing their monastic observance in secular clothes, hoping nobody came to check. Here is a moment I keep returning to when I think about the dissolution. A contemporary account describes the day the commissioners arrived at Denny Abbey in Cambridgeshire. As we mentioned briefly in an earlier part of this story, when they arrived 5 years before the final closure, they encountered half a dozen tearful nuns who wanted immediate release from their vows. Evidence, as we discussed, that not everyone inside those walls was there by choice. But now the actual end has come. The abbey is being formally dissolved. The abbess Elizabeth Throckmorton gathers her nuns, and Elizabeth Throckmorton does not celebrate. She takes her community and retires to her family's manor at Courton Court in Warwickshire. And there in a private house they continue. Same prayers, same hours, same habits, same life without the building. Think about who these women were. Some of them almost certainly had been among the tearful ones 5 years earlier, the ones who said they wanted to leave. But when leaving was forced upon them, when it was the king's decision and not theirs, the calculation changed entirely. Because it turns out that wanting to leave on your own terms is a very different thing from being told to go. The Pilgrimage of Grace, which swept through northern England in October 1536, is one of the most dramatic demonstrations of how deeply the dissolution cut into ordinary life. Roughly 40,000 people, monks, clergy, minor gentry and common people, marched in protest against the monastery closures. They took control of the city of York. They occupied Pontefract Castle. The Tudor monarchy, which in its 27 years of existence had never faced anything quite like this, very nearly fell. The protesters' complaints were many and tangled, but at the heart of them was something specific and practical. The monasteries were gone and the poor had nowhere to go. Because for all the scandals we have talked about in this series, the sealed files, the fox fur pelisses, the escaped nuns, the episcopal visitation reports with their charges of midnight loot playing the monasteries, had also for centuries been running something that nobody else was running. They fed people, they housed travellers, they tended the sick. Every large convent maintained an infirmary that served not just the community but the surrounding countryside. The records from medieval hospitals, those earlier surviving lists of admitted patients in European history, were kept in religious institutions. Historians of medieval medicine are nearly unanimous on this point. For roughly 1,000 years, the primary institutional provider of healthcare to ordinary people in Europe was the religious house, not kings, not universities, not guilds, monasteries and convents. When Henry shut them down, he did not replace them. And the people who had depended on them, the sick, the poor, the travellers, the elderly. The pregnant women who had nowhere else to go felt the gap immediately. England after the dissolution saw a significant increase in begging and vagrancy that the Elizabethan Poor Laws were in part a desperate attempt to address. The monasteries had been the original safety net, and it had been torn out by the roots. Now I want to step back from England for a moment, because the dissolution was the most dramatic and sudden end to monastic life that the medieval world produced, but it was not the only ending. Across northern Europe, the Protestant Reformation swept through convents with similar effect, if varying pace. In the German territories, the Swiss cantons, the Scandinavian kingdoms, religious houses were dissolved, reformed, or simply abandoned, as the institutional ground shifted beneath them. In France and the Catholic South, the convents survived the Reformation for a time, but the French Revolution of the 1780s and 90s would eventually come for them too, dissolving religious communities, confiscating property and sending former nuns out into a world that had no idea what to do with them. One account from the French Revolution describes a group of elderly nuns, women who had entered their convent as teenagers in the 1750s, being turned out into the streets of Paris in 1791. They had spent 40 years inside. They had no money, no family connections that had survived the revolution. They did not know how to shop or cook or navigate a city. The world they had entered as children simply did not exist anymore. I find it genuinely impossible to imagine what that experience felt like. To have your entire frame of reference, every structure of time and obligation and meaning removed in an afternoon. And yet even in all of this, in the dispersal, the poverty, the bewilderment, something survived. The manuscripts survived, or many of them did, scattered by the dissolution into private hands, into newly founded university libraries, into the collections of wealthy men who bought them cheaply from the crown. The books made it. The medical knowledge survived. The herbal traditions that Hildegard had documented, that generations of convent infirmaries had practiced and refined, they passed into the hands of trained physicians, apothecaries, and eventually universities. The basic structure of hospital care, the idea that an institution owed a duty of care to the sick, regardless of their ability to pay, never entirely disappeared. The music survived. The liturgical compositions that medieval nuns had created and performed for centuries entered the Western musical canon. Hildegard's 69 compositions were not discovered until modern times. They'd been waiting in archives for centuries, but when scholars found them, they found one of the largest surviving compositional bodies from any composer of the entire High Middle Ages, and the record survived. The episcopal registers, the visitation reports, the sealed files, the archbishop's furious letter about Joan of Leeds, the Florentine archive folder about Benedetta Carlini, the diary entries and the letters and the testimony, all of it survived. Here is something I want you to think about. We are in this story 9 centuries removed from the women we've been talking about. 900 years. The world has changed in ways that no medieval person could have imagined. The political structures, the social structures, the medical understanding, the technology, all of it is radically unrecognizably different. And yet the questions these women's lives raise have not changed at all. What does it mean to choose a life? What does it mean when the choice is made for you? What do we owe to institutions that give us structure and meaning? What do we owe to ourselves when those institutions demand too much? How do we hold simultaneously the good that a system produces and the harm that the same system enables? How do we honour people who lived in circumstances we find troubling without either condemning them for not being modern or sanitising their world into something easier to look at? These are not abstract historical questions. They are the same questions that every generation, including ours, is still asking, just in different forms, about different institutions, in different languages. I have been sitting with this story for a long time in preparing this series, and the thing that stays with me most, more than any individual woman, more than any specific case or document, is something simpler. The women who lived behind those walls were real. Completely, specifically, irreducibly real. They had preferences about food. They had friendships that mattered to them. They found certain prayers more meaningful than others. They were sometimes cold and sometimes warm. They had days when the life they were living felt like exactly the right life, and days when it felt like a cage. And most of them died inside those walls without ever knowing that anyone would still be talking about them in a video 900 years later. That is something. Not a comfort exactly, but something. So here we are, 10 parts into a story that began with a gate closing behind a 7-year-old girl and has taken us through ceremonies and bells and lute-playing nuns and faked deaths and sealed archives, and the most extraordinary woman who ever invented a language and wrote theology, approved by the Pope and brewed herbal medicine, and changed the history of music, all from inside a building she was barely allowed to leave. We have talked about what they built. We have talked about what was taken from them. We have talked about what survived. But there is still one more dimension we have not fully explored. The question that underlies everything in this story. Whether you are a scholar or a casual listener, whether you find this world fascinating or heartbreaking or both, what does it all mean, not just for medieval history, for us, right now? For the way we think about institutions and freedom and what it means to belong somewhere, for the way we honour the people of the past without romanticising them, for the way we hold complexity without resolving it prematurely into something simpler than it was. That is the conversation we are heading into next. And it is, I think, the conversation that this whole long night has been building toward. You know what question has been quietly running underneath this entire story? Not the historical questions, though. Those have been fascinating enough. Not the question of who these women were or what they built or how they suffered. The deeper question. The one that lingers after all the facts have been laid out. Was it a refuge or was it a prison? And I want to tell you right now at the start of this second to last chapter that I am not going to give you a clean answer. Because the honest answer is that both things were true, simultaneously, in the same buildings, sometimes in the same person. And sitting with that discomfort, really sitting with it, not flinching away, is where I think this story becomes genuinely useful to us today. Let us go back to a moment we touched on briefly. The Council of Trent, which ran through the middle of the 16th century, was the Catholic Church's formal response to the Protestant Reformation, its attempt to reform itself, clarify its doctrine, and shore up its authority. Among its many decrees was a reaffirmation and strengthening of the principle of enclosure. All women in religious life were to be cloistered. They were to remain inside the convent walls. They were not to leave. They were not to receive visitors freely. The convent was to be in the fullest possible sense a sealed world. Now, one response to this decree, the response you might expect from women who loved the life, would be acceptance, even gratitude. A firmer boundary meant a safer sanctuary, but that is not what happened. What happened is that many communities of active religious women, women who ran schools and hospitals and orphanages, who walked through cities and markets and countryside doing the work they believed God had called them, to fought this decree with everything they had. The Ursulines founded in 1535 in northern Italy. by Angela Mercy were established specifically as an order of women who would live in the world, serve the poor and the sick and the uneducated, and maintain their vows without being enclosed. No walls, no cloister, active service. For decades they resisted the Church's pressure to enclose them. Eventually most Ursuline communities capitulated. The walls went up. The active ministry was curtailed. But here is what I find remarkable. There were individual Ursuline houses that found ways to maintain their active work anyway. By negotiating exemptions, by creative interpretation of the rules, by building relationships with local bishops who valued their hospital work, more than they feared the canonical technicalities. In other words, the same ingenuity and stubbornness that Joan of Leeds used to build a dummy and fake her death, applied not to escape but to preservation of something the women valued. The convent walls that were supposed to contain women's lives were in some cases the precise structures that gave those women the institutional authority to keep doing what they wanted to do. This is the paradox at the heart of medieval convent life, and it is a paradox that I do not think we can resolve by choosing one side. Let me give you two women, both real, from roughly the same period. The first is the kind of woman we met in part 1. She was placed in a convent at age 8 by parents who could not afford her dowry. She grew up inside those walls. She took vows she did not choose. She lived a life that had been decided for her before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. She is the woman the Archbishop condemned, the woman who ran or wanted to run, the woman Arcangela Tarabotti wrote about in her furious books about monastic tyranny. She is real. Her experience is real. Her suffering was real. And any account of medieval convent life that ignores her is a fairy tale, not history. The second woman is different. She is the kind of woman Eileen Power described as a female intellectual who found in the convent the only open door. The woman who could not imagine marriage, who found the idea of being absorbed into another family's household, of producing children, on demand, of never having an hour to read or think or create, genuinely unbearable. For whom the walls of the convent were not a trap but a perimeter, a boundary that protected her time, her mind, her work, from a world that would otherwise consume all three. She is also real. Her relief was real. And any account that denies her the right to have found genuine freedom inside those walls is also a fairy tale, just a different one. The medieval scholar Sharon Elkins, who studied 12th century women's religious communities in detail, made a point that I think is essential. She found that in the earliest, least regulated phase of medieval women's religious life, before the enclosure decrees, before the male orders tightened their control, women sought out religious community not because they were forced to, but because they were choosing the most expansive life available to them. Not expansive by our standards, but expansive by theirs. The early women's communities, the double monasteries, the informal groups of devout women that gathered around charismatic teachers in the early medieval period, these were in their original form profoundly voluntary. Women coming together to build something, to study, to pray, to create, to serve. The institution that later became a mechanism of social control began as a form of social innovation, created by women for women on their own terms, and then slowly across centuries the male institutional hierarchy found it, and began to regulate it, contain it, use it for its own purposes, until the original spirit was buried under layers of canon law and episcopal oversight and forced dowries and closed gates. That is not a simple story of oppression. It is a story of something real being corrupted by power, which is, I would suggest, a pattern that applies well beyond the medieval cloister. Do you want to know what I find most striking about all of this, having spent all this time with it? It is the extraordinary range. Within the category of medieval convent life, within those stone walls, under those bells, behind those locked gates, you could find the terrified 7-year-old oblate who grew up to be a brilliant, genuinely contented abbess, and the 17-year-old placed there against her will who spent 40 years quietly miserable, and the intellectual for whom the library was more precious than any freedom she was denied, and the woman who ran at 35 built a new life and never looked back, and the mystic who composed music that still moves people to tears 9 centuries later, and the community of nuns who continued their vows in a private manor house long after the institution that housed them had been demolished. All of them are in this story. All of them are part of what a medieval convent actually was, and the historical mistake, but also the human mistake, is trying to collapse all of them into one story. Either the story of holy women peacefully serving God, or the story of oppressed women trapped by patriarchal institutions. Both stories are true, neither story is enough. Here is where I want to make a turn that might surprise you, because I have been thinking about the people watching this video as I work through all of this material, and I keep coming back to a question that is not about the Middle Ages at all. How many of us are currently inside institutions, companies, families, communities, roles that we did not fully choose, that give us something essential that also cost us something we mourn, and that we would not quite know how to leave even if someone unlocked the gate? I am not being glib. I am not collapsing medieval convent life into a metaphor for your Tuesday morning commute. What I am suggesting is that the questions these women's lives raise are genuinely live questions. What is the difference between a structure that supports you and a structure that confines you? When does community become coercion? When does meaning become obligation? When does belonging become captivity? These are not medieval questions. They are permanent questions, and the medieval convent at its most intense and most compressed is one of the most revealing laboratories in human history for watching those questions work themselves out. Let me tell you about a woman named Mary Ward. She was born in Yorkshire, England in 1585, just 45 years after the last English convent was dissolved by Henry VIII. She was the daughter of a devout Catholic family in a Protestant country, and from her early 20s she had a clear, specific, burning conviction about what she was called to do. She wanted to found a religious order of women, an active order, women who would run schools, serve the poor, work in the world the way the male Jesuits did, without enclosure, without walls. She spent the better part of her life fighting the Catholic Church to allow this. She founded her Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1611. She was condemned by a papal bull in 1631. The institute was suppressed. She was briefly imprisoned by the Inquisition. Her followers scattered. She was called a heretic, a schismatic, a presumptuous woman who did not understand her proper place in the order of things. She kept going. She died in 1645, still fighting, still building, still insisting that God had not called her to sit behind a wall. In 1978, more than 3 centuries after her death, the institutional descendants of her original order received formal papal recognition as a religious congregation. 333 years. That is how long it took the Church to officially acknowledge that Mary Ward had been right. I find Mary Ward's story almost unbearably moving, not just because of the persistence, but because of what she was fighting against. She was not fighting against the vocation. She was not fighting against prayer or poverty or service or community. She was fighting against the specific institutional form that had been imposed on those things. She wanted the essence. She was willing to fight the institution to get it, and that distinction between the thing itself and the institutional form it has been given is one that shows up again and again in this story. The women who wept when the English convents were dissolved were not most of them weeping for the buildings. They were weeping for the community, the rhythm, the sense of purpose. the thing that the institution had housed which the institution's destruction could not entirely destroy. Because Elizabeth Throckmorton and her nuns took that thing to Kefton Court, and Sion Abbey's community carried it into exile and kept it alive for 5 centuries, and Mary Ward carried it into the teeth of institutional opposition and refused to let go of it even when the institution tried to kill it. The form can be destroyed. The impulse underneath the form is much harder to extinguish. What is that impulse at its best, in its most genuine expression? I think it is the impulse toward a life that is about something larger than the self. That is not unique to medieval Christianity. It is not unique to religious life. You find it in soldiers and scientists and artists and teachers and parents, and anyone who has ever subordinated their personal comfort to something they believed mattered more. The medieval convent was one particular historical form that this impulse took, one that was shaped by, and in many cases distorted by, the specific pressures of its time, the patriarchal church, the feudal economy, the brutal practical realities of medieval women's lives. But underneath all of that, in the women who chose it genuinely, in the abbesses who ran institutions that outlasted kingdoms, in the composers who wrote music for an audience they would never meet, in the herbalists who tended the sick with knowledge they had spent decades acquiring, there was something real, something that deserves to be seen clearly, not idealized, not condemned, seen. Here is the thing about the question we started with. Was it a refuge or a prison? I think the most honest answer is it was exactly as much of a refuge as the person inside it had chosen it to be, and exactly as much of a prison as the person inside it had been given no choice. And in most individual lives it was both of those things at different moments, on different days, in different decades, because that is what institutions are, that is what communities are. That is what most of the structures that shape our lives actually are, not purely one thing or the other, but complex, layered, simultaneously liberating and constraining, reflecting both the best impulses of the people who built them and the worst tendencies of any human institution given too much power. The medieval convent was a very extreme version of something very ordinary, and understanding it clearly without the rose tint, without the horror, is, I think, a way of understanding something about ourselves. I want to share one more thing before we move to the final chapter of this story. It is a small thing, almost a footnote, but it is the one that has stayed with me longer than anything else in this entire series. In the ruins of Whitby Abbey, the clifftop monastery that Hilda built in 657, the one destroyed by Danish raiders in 867 and rebuilt after the Norman conquest, and then dissolved by Henry VIII in 1539. In those ruins, archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human occupation stretching from the 7th century to the 16th. Almost 900 years, different people, different buildings, different kings and languages and plagues, the same cliff, the same sea, the same bells that rang in one form or another for nearly a millennium, and today those ruins are still there. You can stand in them and look out at the North Sea, and hear if you want to the very faint echo of everything that happened inside those walls. All the women whose names we know, and the vastly larger number whose names we have lost. All the prayers, the manuscripts, the music, the meals, eaten in silence, the arguments, the friendships, the escapes, the returns. The walls fell, the bells stopped ringing, the institution ended. But something lingers, not a ghost, not a metaphor, just the stubborn, inarguable fact that human beings lived here for 900 years and tried in the ways available to them to make something meaningful out of the time they had. There is one final piece of this story, the piece that asks what we take from all of it, not just as a historical lesson, but as the thing you carry with you when the video ends and the night goes quiet and you are alone with your own thoughts. What does 1,000 years of women behind stone walls with their bells and their beer and their escapes and their extraordinary minds have to tell us about how to live? That is the question we will end with. And I think it might be the most important one of all. Pull the blanket a little closer, because this is the last part of the story, and I want to make sure you are comfortable for it. We have travelled a long way together tonight. We started with a gate closing behind a 7-year-old girl. We walked through ceremonies and cold dormitories and beer for breakfast. We met abbesses who counselled emperors and mystics who invented languages. We sat with the sealed archives and the faked deaths, and the women who played lute until midnight, and the ones who composed music that still makes people weep when they hear it today. And in the last part we sat with the hardest question, refuge or prison, and found that the honest answer is both, always both. Now we are at the end, and I want to do something a little different. I do not want to summarize. You have been here for the whole journey. You do not need a summary. What I want to do instead is think out loud with you about what any of this actually means. Not as a historical exercise, as a living question. Let me start with something that surprised me. When I began working on this story, I expected to find two kinds of narratives in the historical record. The first, pious women joyfully devoted living out their vows in perfect spiritual harmony. The second, oppressed women trapped by patriarchal institutions denied any real choice or voice. Both of those narratives exist in the popular imagination, and both of them, as we've discovered together across these 12 parts, are partial truths that become lies when they pretend to be the whole story. What I did not expect to find, and what I keep coming back to, is how relentlessly ordinary most of it was. Not ordinary as in boring, ordinary as in recognisably human. The nuns who gossiped and formed cliques. The ones who kept rabbits they were not supposed to have. The ones who sat through prayers they found tedious, and the ones who found them transcendent. The abbesses who were brilliant managers and the ones who were terrible at it. The women who genuinely thrived in community, and the ones for whom the enforced proximity was a daily quiet agony. These are not medieval problems. These are human problems, wearing medieval clothes, behind medieval walls, but recognisable to anyone who has ever worked in an office, lived in a family, belonged to a community, or tried to build a life inside a structure that was not entirely of their choosing. Here is what I think this story is actually about. It is about the relationship between structure and freedom, and the fact that those two things, which we tend to think of as opposites, are in reality deeply, uncomfortably entangled. The most structured life in this entire series was Hildegard of Bingen's. 8 canonical hours of prayer per day, total enclosure, vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, no independent travel, no independent property, no independent income, the complete subordination of personal preference to communal rule. And within that structure, the tightest possible structure, she produced more original work than almost any other person of her century. 3 volumes of visionary theology, 69 musical compositions, 2 books of medicine, 400 letters, 1 invented language, 2 convents. She did not produce this despite the structure. She produced it in part because of it, because the structure removed certain decisions from her plate permanently. She never had to wonder what she was going to do today. She never had to negotiate with a household for time to think. She never had to justify her intellectual work to a husband or manage the social performance that medieval upper-class women were expected to maintain. The structure, which would have been suffocating to someone who had not chosen it, was for her a kind of radical simplification. It cleared the field, and in the cleared field she built one of the most astonishing bodies of work in the entire history of the medieval world. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I am not saying constraints are good, therefore constrain yourself. That would be a deeply irresponsible reading of this history. What I am saying is something more specific. The women in this story who thrived, genuinely thrived, were almost always women for whom the structure of convent life aligned with something they already wanted. They wanted to read and think. They wanted to be part of a community of women. They wanted the rhythm of prayer to organize their days. They wanted to serve something larger than themselves. When the structure aligned with the desire, it was generative. When the structure was imposed on a desire that pointed somewhere completely different, when the girl who wanted to dance had been placed behind walls by a father who wanted to avoid paying a marriage dowry, the same structure became a cage. The structure itself was neutral. The alignment or the absence of it was everything. And here is the thing that I cannot shake. In our world, in the world you and I inhabit, we have almost infinite structural freedom compared to those medieval women. We can choose our careers, our partners, our locations, our communities. We can leave situations that do not fit us. We can redesign our lives in ways that no medieval person could have imagined. And yet, we are also drowning in choices. We spend enormous energy, sometimes most of our waking energy, on the maintenance of options, keeping every door open, not committing too fully to any one thing in case something better comes along. The medieval nun, for all that she was constrained, had one thing that we struggle to manufacture certainty about what her life was for. She knew what she was doing tomorrow. She knew what she was doing every day for the rest of her life. She knew which community she belonged to, what role she played, what was expected of her. The philosopher William James wrote that the great thing about forming a habit is that it frees the mind for higher work. When the lower decisions are made, when what to do and when to do it is settled, the mind has room for something else. For writing theology, for composing music, for inventing languages, for thinking thoughts that nobody else had yet thought. The medieval convent at its best was a machine for creating exactly that kind of freedom. Freedom through structure, capacity through constraint. Is there a lesson in that for us? I think there might be. Not a prescription, a question. What are the structures in your life that you are treating as cages when they might actually be clearing the field? What are the commitments you have made to people, to work, to community that you resist because they limit your options, when in reality they are the thing that is making your best work possible? I am not telling you to stay in situations that are genuinely harmful. The women in this story who ran the Joan of Leeds of history, the Agnes de Flixthorpe who escaped 3 times they were right to run. Their situations required escape, not reframing. But I am asking a more subtle question. Are there things in your life that feel like walls that are actually foundations? It is a question worth sitting with, especially in the quiet of a night like this one. There is another thing this story has been teaching me, about legacy, about what survives. We began this series with a question about why the medieval convent matters. Why we should spend an evening, let alone 12 parts of one very long evening with women who have been dead for 8 or 9 centuries in a world that barely resembles ours. The answer, I think, is not that their experiences are directly relevant to ours. They are not. The specific circumstances of medieval convent life have no analogue in the 21st century, and I want to be careful not to flatten the genuine historical distance by pretending that everything maps neatly onto the present. The answer instead is that the questions their lives raised have never been answered to anyone's satisfaction, and that means they are still live, still running underneath the surface of how we organize our communities, how we think about institutions, how we manage the relationship between individual desire and collective obligation. Every workplace is in some small way working through the same problems that a medieval convent was working through. Every family, every religious community, every political movement. How do you build a structure that enables people to do their best work without subjugating their fundamental humanity? How do you maintain collective discipline without making individuals into instruments? How do you hold power responsibly in a closed institution? How do you honour tradition without being imprisoned by it? The medieval church got these questions badly wrong in many ways. Badly enough that the abuses we have documented in this series are genuinely troubling to look at honestly. But the fact that these questions were being worked through at all, the fact that women were building institutions, defending them, fighting over them, reforming them, escaping them, memorializing them, means that the people inside them were genuinely engaged with something real. Not a historical curiosity, a human project. Let me tell you the last piece of historical evidence I want to share with you. It comes from a convent in northern England sometime in the early 14th century. The exact convent is not known. But the document that survives a short text, a set of instructions for a young novice, has a passage in it that I find more moving than almost anything else I have encountered in this entire series. The text is instructing a new nun on how to approach the daily prayers, and it says in its slightly archaic way that she should not rush through the words, that each word said with attention is a gift offered to God, that even on the days when the words feel meaningless, when she is tired or distracted or cold, she should still say them, because the discipline of showing up even when you do not feel it is itself a form of faithfulness. And then it says something that stopped me entirely when I read it. It says the prayers you say on the hard days are the ones that matter most, because those are the days when you are not praying because it feels good. You are praying because you have decided it is worth doing. And decision chosen freely in the absence of feeling is closer to genuine faith than anything that comes easily. I am not a religious person, and I suspect a significant portion of the people watching this are not either. But I think that passage is saying something that has nothing specific to do with God. It is saying something about how anything meaningful gets built, about how any commitment to a person, to a craft, to a community is maintained through the years when it does not feel natural, not through the beautiful days when everything is flowing and the music plays itself, through the cold mornings when the bell rings at 2 a.m. and you get up anyway, not because it feels good, because you have decided it is worth it. That is not a medieval lesson. That is just the lesson. Here is where I want to end tonight. Not with a summary of facts, not with a historical conclusion, with an image. Somewhere in Europe tonight, in Germany, in France, in Belgium, in England, there are ancient stone buildings still standing that were once medieval convents. Some are ruins. Open to the sky, their walls grown over with moss, their chapels roofless, and their dormitories exposed to the rain. Some are still functioning, still housing religious communities, still ringing bells at specific hours, still maintaining some version of the rhythm that began in the 6th century with a monk in a cave in Italy who thought that a life organized around prayer and work was the best life a human being could live. And some of those ancient buildings have been repurposed, turned into hotels or schools or apartment buildings or offices. New generations of people living and working inside walls that were laid down by medieval hands, walking floors that medieval feet wore smooth eating breakfast in rooms where women once sat in total silence while someone read the Psalms from an elevated pulpit. They probably do not think about it. Why would they? But those walls know. In whatever way walls can be said to know anything in the accumulated record of everything that happened inside them in the stone itself, which holds the shapes of all those years, those walls carry the story of millions of women. Women who were fierce and frightened and brilliant and ordinary. Women who chose this life and women who had no choice. Women who found God there and women who found only themselves. Women who created things that lasted 9 centuries, and women whose names we do not know and never will. They all passed through the same gate. They all heard the same bells. They all sat at the same tables, said the same prayers, slept under the same cold roofs. and every single one of them was entirely irreducibly, unmistakably human, just like us. We have been together for a long time tonight. 12 parts, a lot of history, a lot of questions, more complicated than answers. I hope you found something in it that is useful to you. Not just interesting, though, I hope it has been that too. Something useful, some question that you will carry into the next few days and find worth turning over. Because that for me is what the best history does. It does not tell us what to do. It does not offer clean lessons or simple morals. It shows us that the problems we're living inside have been lived inside before, by people who were in the ways that matter most exactly like us, and who navigated them imperfectly, beautifully, sometimes badly, sometimes brilliantly with the tools they had. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what we are doing. If you are still here, if you've made it through all 12 parts of this story, I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate that. Spending hours with someone is an act of trust. You gave me your time, your night, the quiet of your evening, and I did not take that lightly in the making of this. Every detail, every name, every historical document I referenced, Hilda of Whitby and Hildegard of Bingen and Joan of Leeds and Benedetta Carlini, and the unnamed nun at Cannington and Agnes de Flixthorpe who ran 3 times, and Elizabeth Throckmorton who refused to stop being herself, even after Henry VIII told her the life she had chosen was over. Every one of them deserved to be told with care. And I hope in some measure they were. If this story moved you, if something in it resonated, surprised you, made you think about something differently, I would genuinely love to know what it was. The comment section is a real place. Real people read what is written there. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me which woman you want to know more about. Tell me if you think I got something wrong. And if you're not subscribed yet, if you found this by accident and stayed for 12 parts, then you already know the answer to the subscription question. This is the kind of thing we do here. Long, slow, careful, honest stories. The ones that do not fit in a headline. The ones that take all night to tell properly. There is another story coming. I cannot tell you yet what it is, but I can tell you it will be worth the wait. And wherever you are right now, in your bed, on your couch, on a night shift, on a long drive, anywhere that this voice has reached you in the dark, thank you for being here. The bells have stopped ringing, the gate is open, sleep well,